Silas Crowder pressed the branding iron into the coals and smiled. Not the smile of a man handling business. The smile of a man who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "Hold her still," he said. Two ranch hands grabbed Tamsin Vale by the arms. Her wrists were already bound. The rope had been cutting into her skin since before sunrise, and the yard was full. 60 men standing in the cold morning air, watching, none of them moving, none of them speaking. The iron glowed orange at the tip. Crowder turned to face her. "You want to tell people you paid your debt?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Fine. We'll give you something to remember it by." Tamsin's eyes swept the yard. 60 faces. Some she recognized. Men she had worked beside for years. Men who had eaten at the same fire, mended the same fences, slept in the same bunkhouse dust. Not one of them stepped forward. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. "Please help me." Silence answered her. Then hoofbeats. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where one person refuses to look away when everyone else does, then subscribe to this channel and follow along to the very end. We post new stories every week, and every single one will surprise you. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1887, and to the woman 60 men tried to break. The hoofbeats were slow, unhurried, the kind of pace that belongs to a man who has already decided something and doesn't need to rush about it. Every head in the yard turned. The rider came through the main gate without stopping, without calling out, without any of the hesitation a sensible man would show riding into a crowd of armed ranch hands on private land. He rode a dark bay horse, big and road-worn, and he sat it the way some men sit in their own kitchen, like the space belonged to him regardless of whose name was on the deed. Silas Crowder didn't lower the iron. "Whoever you are," he called out, "you're interrupting private business." The rider didn't answer. He kept moving through the crowd at that same unhurried walk, and the men parted for him. Not because anyone told them to, but because something in the way he moved made stepping aside feel like the obvious choice. He pulled up 10 feet from where Tamsin stood between the two men gripping her arms. His eyes went to her first, then to the rope around her wrists, then to the iron in Crowder's hand, still trailing a thin thread of heat. Then he swung down from the saddle like he had all morning. He was broad across the shoulders and lean everywhere else, weather-beaten in the way of men who have spent more nights outside than in. His coat was trail-dusty, and his jaw hadn't seen a razor in days. He had the kind of face that had been through enough that it didn't bother arranging itself into expressions for other people's benefit. He walked forward until he was standing directly between Tamsin and Crowder. "That iron touches her," he said, and his voice was quiet enough that the men closest had to lean slightly to catch it. "You'll have to come through me first." Crowder stared at him. The yard went so still that Tamsin could hear the fire crackling under the iron stand. Crowder's smile came back, but it was working harder now. "Son, I don't know who you think you are, but you just rode into a private arrangement between an employer and his debtor. I'd suggest you climb back on that horse before what?" The question landed flat. Not aggressive, just a flat, simple question from a man who genuinely wanted to hear the answer. Crowder opened his mouth, closed it. One of the hands holding Tamsin shifted his weight, just slightly, but she felt it. "I asked her a question," the rider said. "What does she owe?" "That's none of your— What does she owe?" Crowder's jaw tightened. He looked around the yard, at his 60 men, at the iron, at this stranger standing in the middle of his property like he had every right to be there, and he made a calculation. Because Silas Crowder was, above everything else, a man who made calculations. He had 60 men. The stranger had a horse and a pair of hands. But the stranger was standing very still and watching Crowder with the kind of patience that suggested he had been in worse situations than this and had not found them particularly worrying. "Her father owed me money," Crowder said. "She agreed to work it off. 7 years, and she still hasn't cleared the account." "Then show me the account." "I don't answer to—" "Show me the account," the rider said again, "or that iron stays where it is." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of how things were going to go. And something in the delivery of it, the absolute flatness of it, the lack of performance, made Crowder hesitate in a way he had not hesitated in a very long time. Behind the stranger's shoulder, Tamsin was staring at the back of his head. She didn't know this man. She had never seen him before in her life. She didn't know why he was here or what he wanted or whether he was going to get himself shot in the next 30 seconds. She only knew that he had placed himself between her and the iron, and that her wrists were still bound, and that her arms were starting to ache from the grip of the two men holding her. "Fine," Crowder said. He handed the iron to one of the hands beside him with a look that said, "Hold this and be ready. You want to see the numbers? Come inside, we'll look at the numbers." "Here," the writer said. "Bring them here." Another pause. Crowder's smile had gone very thin. "Bring the ledger out," he said to one of the hands, "and bring the contract." It took 4 minutes for the ledger to appear. 4 minutes in which nobody spoke and nobody moved, and the fire under the iron stand kept burning, and the sun kept climbing, and Tamsin stood with her wrists bound and her jaw set and her heart knocking hard against her ribs. She had not cried yet. She had promised herself she would not cry in this yard in front of these men, and she had kept that promise through the binding of her wrists and the lighting of the fire and the full hour of standing in the cold, waiting for whatever Crowder intended to do with that iron. She had kept it even when the 60 men refused to answer her. She was keeping it now. The hand came back with a ledger book and a folded contract, and Crowder took them and held them out to the stranger with the expression of a man showing his cards because he knows his hand is better. The writer took the ledger. He opened it. He looked at the first page for a moment, then the second, and something shifted slightly in his expression. Not shock, but recognition. The way a man looks when he sees something he half expected. "She can read?" he asked, without looking up. "She can," Tamsin said. She said it before Crowder could answer. The writer turned and looked at her directly for the first time. Brown eyes, slightly tired, carrying something behind them that she couldn't name. "What's your name?" "Tamsin Vale." He held the ledger out to her. Just like that. Held it out across the space between them, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Then you look at it." Crowder took a step forward. "Now wait just a—" "She looks at it," the writer said, and the two words fell like a door closing. One of the men holding Tamsin's arms let go. Slowly, like he wasn't entirely sure he was doing it. The other followed a second later, and Tamsin brought her bound wrists up and took the ledger from the stranger's hands and opened it. Her father's debt was listed on the 3rd page. She had seen it before, or thought she had. Crowder had shown her the numbers once early on when she first came to Blackthorn Ranch and agreed to the arrangement. $438. Her father had borrowed it for seed and equipment after 2 bad harvests, and then her father had died, and then there was nobody left to pay it but Tamsin. $438. She had carried that number in her head for 7 years like a stone she couldn't put down. She looked at the wage column now. What Crowder had promised her per year, written in his own hand on the signed contract. She multiplied it out. 7 years. Her lips moved slightly. Then she looked at the expense column. Her breath stopped. Not the expenses she'd known about, the ones for her housing and the use of ranch equipment and the basic supplies she needed to work. Those she'd accounted for. She had done these calculations herself on scraps of paper she kept hidden under the floorboard of the bunkhouse she slept in, and she had known for 2 years that the numbers didn't add up right. But she hadn't known this. There was a line item, repeated monthly, varying slightly in amount but always present, labeled Supplemental Provisions, Vale T. She stared at it. Supplemental Provisions. Every month for 7 years. The amounts were not small. "What is this?" she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of how level it came out. "Food," Crowder said. "You eat more than—" "I eat what everyone else eats," Tamsin said. "I eat at the same table and I take the same portions, and I have never once asked for anything extra, and you know it. A woman your size requires—" "Show me the receipts," Tamsin said. Silence. "Show me the purchase receipts that correspond to these charges," she said. "Every month for 7 years. If you spent this money on food for me, there are receipts." Crowder's smile disappeared entirely for the first time. "The receipts aren't here," he said. "They're at the main house." "Then we'll wait." "Tamsin!" Crowder's voice dropped. It became something that was not quite a threat but lived right next to one. "You need to be very careful right now about what you're accusing me of." "I'm not accusing you of anything," she said. "I'm looking at your ledger. You showed it to this man yourself." The writer was watching the exchange without expression. His arms were loose at his sides. He hadn't moved since giving her the book. Tamsin turned back to the ledger. She kept her hands steady. She added the fabricated food charges for a single year. Then she held that number against her annual wages. The food charges alone every year exceeded half her promised salary. She stood there with 60 men around her and ropes still binding her wrists, and the truth of it spreading through her chest like cold water. And she understood something she had been close to understanding for 2 years, but had never quite let herself see all the way through. She was never going to pay this off. Not because she hadn't worked hard enough, not because the debt was too large, but because Crowder kept making the debt larger, every single month, in his own handwriting, in his own ledger, underline items with official-sounding names that meant nothing and had receipts that didn't exist. She would have worked for him until she died. That had always been the plan. "Rourke Maddox," said a voice near the back of the crowd. It started as a murmur. Then it moved forward through the men like a current. "That's Rourke Maddox." Tamsin looked up. The name meant something even to her, right? Even 7 years deep in Crowder's ranch with limited access to the wider world. Rourke Maddox was the kind of name that got spoken a certain way in territories like Wyoming. Bounty hunters had been trying to bring him in for 3 years, and none of them had managed it. She had heard his name twice in the bunkhouse, always attached to some story about a thing he had done that shouldn't have been possible. She looked at the man standing beside her. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was watching Crowder. "Rourke Maddox," Crowder repeated. His voice had changed. Not afraid. Crowder was not a man who frightened easily, but recalibrating, reassessing, running new calculations. "I wondered when you'd show up in my territory." "I'm not here for you," Rourke said. "No." Crowder looked at Tamsin. "Apparently you're here for her." He let the word carry everything he intended it to carry. All the mockery, all the dismissal, the suggestion that any man who would risk his life for a woman who looked like Tamsin Vale must be either stupid or desperate, or both. Rourke's expression didn't change. "I didn't ask what she weighs," he said. "I asked what she owes." Something shifted in the yard. Tamsin felt it. A subtle change in the air, in the way the men around her were standing. The murmur had died. People were listening now in a different way. "Her debt," Rourke continued, "as written in your ledger, should have been cleared 4 years ago. Her wages minus the documented housing and supply costs exceed her father's original loan by—" He glanced at Tamsin. $263, she said. "By my calculation." "By her calculation," Rourke repeated. He looked at Crowder steadily. "So either your bookkeeper can't add or those food charges are invented. Either way, I'd say you're the one who owes something." Crowder stared at him for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was the wrong laugh, too loud, too sharp, the laugh of a man buying himself time to think. "She's been talking to you," Crowder said, "working on you. That's what she does. She works on people, tells them she's been mistreated, makes herself out to be—" "I rode in off the trail 20 minutes ago," Rourke said. "I never met this woman before today. I stopped because I saw a man about to brand a bound woman in front of 60 people who apparently lost the use of their legs." Dead quiet. One of the hands near the back coughed. Crowder's jaw worked. He looked at the ledger in Tamsin's hands, then at his 60 men, then at the iron stand where the branding iron was still sitting in the coals, still glowing. "That ledger," he said carefully, "is private property." "You handed it to me," Rourke said. "I want it back." "When Tamsin's done with it. Now." Rourke took one step forward. Just one. He didn't reach for the weapon at his hip. He didn't raise his voice. He just moved one step closer to Crowder and said, "When Tamsin's done with it, and the repetition of it, the complete, unbothered repetition, was somehow worse than any threat." Crowder did not take the step back, but he didn't take the ledger either. Tamsin kept reading. She turned pages carefully, methodically, the way she had taught herself to do everything on this ranch, without hurry, without the panic that would make her miss things. Rourke stood beside her and nobody moved. On the 11th page she found a name she recognized, Margaret Holloway. A widow who had worked Blackthorn's kitchen for 3 years before disappearing. Tamsin had been told the woman left voluntarily, moved east to live with relatives. Margaret Holloway's account showed the same pattern. Wages that should have cleared her debt years earlier. Monthly food charges listed in Crowder's hand. An ever-growing balance that never actually shrank. On page 15, Another name. An immigrant laborer named Piotr Vasek. Page 17. A family named Crow with 3 members listed. Page after page after page. Tamsin turned to look at Rourke. He was watching her face, not the ledger. "This isn't just me," she said. Her voice came out very quiet. "No," he said. "How many?" He shook his head slightly. He didn't know. But they both looked down at the ledger, at the pages of names and fabricated charges and calculated debts that would never be paid, and they understood what they were holding. This wasn't a record of money owed. It was a record of lives collected. Crowder had been doing this for years, finding people who couldn't fight back, widows and immigrants and injured workers and desperate families, people who came to him when they had nothing else. And he had put their names in this book, and he had kept adding numbers until the numbers swallowed them whole. Tamsin raised the ledger. She held it up so the 60 men around her could see it. "He told all of you I cost him extra because of my size," she said. Her voice wasn't shaking anymore. It had passed through something and come out the other side. "He charged me for food I never received. Your own foreman watched me eat at the same table as every other hand for 7 years. He can tell you what I ate." She looked at the foreman, a heavy-set man named Garrett, who had worked Blackthorn longer than anyone. He looked at the ground. "These charges don't exist," Tamsin said. "The receipts don't exist. And I'm not the only one." She turned pages and held up Margaret Holloway's account. Then Piotr Vasek's. "He found people who couldn't say no to him. Then he made sure they never could." Crowder moved fast. He was across the space in 2 strides, his hand reaching for the ledger, his face doing something it hadn't done all morning, genuinely losing its shape. Rourke stepped between them. He caught Crowder's wrist, not hard, just stopped it, and held it, and looked at the man. "Don't," he said. One word. Crowder pulled his arm back. He straightened his coat. He looked at his 60 men. "Seize her," he said. "Seize her and take that book." Nobody moved. Not one man. Crowder's eyes swept the yard. The same 60 men who had stood and watched him bind Tamsin's wrists at sunrise. The same men who had not moved when she said, "Please help me." They were still standing in the same places, in the same cold morning air. But something had turned in them. Tamsin could see it. Something quiet and ashamed and waiting, like men who had been holding a wrong position and were only now realizing they had the option to stop. "I said seize her," Crowder repeated, louder. Garrett, the foreman, looked up from the ground. He looked at Tamsin. He looked at the ledger. He looked at Crowder. Then he took a single step to the side, away from Crowder. That was all. Just one step. But it opened something. 2 men near the fence line shifted their weight. A hand near the water trough turned his body slightly, not toward Tamsin, not taking any position, just turning. Repositioning, choosing not to be where he had been standing. Crowder saw it. His face went very still. "You work for me," he said. "Every man here works for me." Nobody answered. Rourke reached down and cut Tamsin's ropes. He didn't make a show of it. He just pulled a knife, ran it through the binding in one quick motion, and put the knife away. Tamsin's wrists came free, and she pressed them together for a moment, feeling the ache, then straightened. She held the ledger against her chest. She looked at Crowder. He was looking back at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not contempt, not the comfortable amusement of a man who knows he holds all the cards. Something else. Something that lived a few inches behind his eyes, where the calculations happened, and it looked like a man realizing the calculation had gone wrong somewhere and couldn't find where. "You walk out of here with that book," he said quietly, "and you have no idea what you're starting." "Yes, I do," Tamsin said. She walked. Rourke fell into step beside her, his horse trailing behind, and the crowd parted. Not dramatically, not like a story, but slowly and awkwardly, men stepping back and not meeting her eyes, making room because something had shifted and they didn't quite know what to do with it yet. Tamsin walked through 60 men who had watched her beg for help that morning. She walked out through the gate with the dead man's ledger pressed to her chest and an outlaw beside her. And Silas Crowder stood in the center of his yard, surrounded by men who no longer seemed to be working for him in the same way they had been an hour ago, and watched the woman he had kept for 7 years walk away into the morning like she was already somewhere else. The iron in the coals had gone cold by now. He hadn't noticed until just this moment. Well, they were a quarter mile from the ranch gate before either of them spoke. You know what you have, Rourke said. It wasn't a question. I know what I have, Tamsin said. She kept walking. Her boots were cracking through frost on the road, and her wrists were aching, and she was carrying a ledger that might get her killed before nightfall, and she was thinking very clearly. She had found, in the last 40 minutes, that clarity came easily once you stopped waiting for someone to rescue you. Where are you taking it? He asked. I need somewhere I can sit down and go through the whole thing, she said. I need paper and time. I started to see the pattern in there, but I need to map it out properly. Crowder's going to move fast. I know. He'll go to the sheriff first, get a warrant, say you stole it, make this about the ledger instead of what's in it. I know that too. She glanced at him sideways. You've dealt with men like him before. He didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. There's a town, he said. Mercy Ridge, 8 miles east. Boarding house there. Woman named Odessa Flint. She doesn't ask questions. Does she have a table and a lamp? She does. Then that'll do. They walked on. The frost crunched. The morning was coming up pale and cold around them, and somewhere behind them Blackthorn Ranch sat in the early light with its 60 men and its cold iron and the absence of the woman who had just walked out of it carrying the evidence of everything Silas Crowder had ever done. Rourke led his horse. He didn't offer to let Tamsin ride, but she hadn't asked, and she didn't bring it up. She walked the way she always walked, steadily, with her weight settled, taking ground with each step. After a while, she said, "Why did you stop?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Saw a woman with her hands tied, he said finally. Saw a man with a branding iron. And you saw 60 people doing nothing. Yeah. She nodded slowly. Thank you, she said. She said it plainly, without performance, because she meant it that way. He nodded once. They kept walking. The sun came up fully and the frost began to melt off the road, and Tamsin shifted the ledger under her arm and thought about the pages she hadn't finished reading yet. She thought about Margaret Holloway, wherever she was. She thought about Piotr Vasek. She thought about all the names on all the pages she had only begun to count. She thought about what Crowder had been building, one fabricated charge at a time, one desperate person at a time, for what looked like close to 20 years. She had walked out of that yard. But she was not done. Not close. The road to Mercy Ridge was 8 miles, and she had every one of them to plan. The road to Mercy Ridge was not built for comfort. It was built for wagons and cattle and men who didn't have time to complain about the ruts. And Tamsin walked every inch of it with the ledger under her arm and her wrist still aching where the rope had been. Rourke walked beside her. He didn't talk much, which suited her fine. She was thinking, and thinking required quiet, and she had spent 7 years surrounded by men who filled silence with noise because silence made them uncomfortable. Rourke seemed to have no such trouble with it. They were 3 miles out when he said, "You mapped the numbers in your head back there, before I handed you the book." "I've been mapping them for 2 years," she said. "On paper I kept under a floorboard. I knew something was wrong. I just couldn't see all of it." "What tipped you?" "The first year my debt went down, the way it was supposed to." She shifted the ledger to her other arm. "Second year it went down less. Third year, it barely moved. I asked Crowder about it, and he told me feed prices had gone up, ranch costs had gone up, Wyoming winters cost more than I understood." She paused. He said it in a tone that suggested a woman my size should be embarrassed to question him about money. Rourke didn't say anything to that. "Fourth year," she continued, "the debt went up. I asked again. He told me I'd had a hard winter, that my body required more fuel than the other hands, and the ranch had absorbed that cost on my behalf, and I should be grateful." Her jaw tightened. "I went back to my bunkhouse and I did the arithmetic 3 times because I thought I had to be wrong. I wasn't wrong. But you stayed. Where was I going to go?" She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. "My father was dead. The ranch was the only work I had. And Crowder kept reminding me that if I left without settling the debt, he'd file a claim against my father's name, against whatever I tried to do next. He had friends in the Territorial office. He made sure I knew that." Rourke was quiet for a moment. "He keeps people through the threat of what he'll do when they leave." "That's exactly right." She looked at him sideways. "You sound like you've seen the pattern before." He didn't answer that, again with the silence that was its own kind of answer. They walked on. A hawk crossed the sky ahead of them, tilting on the cold air, and Tamsin watched it without really seeing it. She was thinking about the pages she hadn't gotten to yet, the names she'd seen and not had time to read. The weight of what was in the book under her arm was not physical. The ledger wasn't heavy, but it pressed on her in a way she couldn't quite describe. She had been one name in that book for 7 years. There were dozens of names. Mercy Ridge announced itself with a water tower before anything else became visible, a weathered wooden cylinder on 4 legs standing above the tree line like a lighthouse that had forgotten what ocean it was watching. Then the buildings came into view, a main street of maybe 15 structures, a livery at the south end, a general store with its windows catching the mid-morning light. It wasn't much of a town, but it had rooftops and a locked door somewhere in it, and right now that was sufficient. Rourke led his horse to the livery first. Tamsin waited outside, watching the street. A woman hanging laundry across the way glanced at her once and went back to her work. 2 men came out of the general store, talked briefly on the step, and walked off in opposite directions. Nobody seemed particularly alarmed by the sight of a heavy-set woman with rope marks on her wrists standing in the street. That was either good, or it said something unflattering about Mercy Ridge. Rourke came back without the horse. "Odessa's place is at the end of the block," he said. "Green door." The green door was faded to something closer to gray-green, the paint peeling at the corners, but it was solid, and when Odessa Flint opened it, she was solid too. A small, sharp-eyed woman in her 60s with gray hair pinned back, and the expression of someone who had been interrupted before but generally chose to hear people out anyway. She looked at Tamsin, then at Rourke, then at Tamsin again, specifically at her wrists. "Come in," she said. No further questions. The room she gave Tamsin was on the 2nd floor. It had a bed with a quilt, a window that looked out over the alley, and a door with a bolt on the inside. Odessa pointed at the bolt specifically. "Slides all the way over," she said. "There's a wedge on the floor if you want extra." Tamsin looked at the bolt for a moment. 7 years of sleeping in a bunkhouse with no lock at all. 7 years of Crowder's ranch hands coming and going at any hour. She reached out and slid the bolt across and listened to the solid sound of it catching. "Thank you," she said. Odessa left without ceremony. Rourke had taken a chair in the downstairs sitting room without being invited, and Tamsin heard Odessa say something short to him on her way to the kitchen, and heard him respond in a low voice. She couldn't make out the words. She sat at the small table under the window with Crowder's ledger open in front of her, and she began to read. It took her until noon to get through the full book. She used the back pages of a Bible she found in the table drawer, the blank pages, front and back, all of them, to map out what she found. Names and dates and figures organized in columns because her mind worked in columns, had always worked in columns, even before she understood why numbers felt more honest to her than most things people said out loud. The pattern was consistent enough to be intentional. That was what got to her most. Not the scale of it, not the number of names, but how consistent it was. Crowder hadn't stumbled into this. He hadn't made accounting errors that happened to benefit him. The structure was deliberate. The fabricated charges were deliberate. The specific targeting of people who had the least ability to push back, widows, immigrants, people far from family, people whose desperation had brought them to Blackthorn in the first place, that was deliberate. He had built a machine. She was still staring at her notes when footsteps came up the stairs and a knock landed on her door. "It's me," Rourke said. She crossed and unbolted it. He came in and looked at the table, the open ledger, the Bible pages covered in her handwriting, the organized columns, and stood there taking it in. 19 years, she said. "Best I can date it. He's been doing this for 19 years. Rourke sat down on the edge of the bed. It creaked under him. He was quiet. "There are 41 names in this book," Tamsin continued. "Some are still working at Blackthorn. I recognized 8 of them. The rest either left or—" She stopped. "Some I don't know what happened to. One is listed as account closed, debt forgiven. I can't figure out what that means." "Means they died," Rourke said. "He forgives a debt when there's nobody left to collect from." She looked at him. "Account closed," he said again. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table. "How many of those?" She checked her notes. 7. He was quiet for long enough that she set down her pencil. "You know something about this?" she said. Not a question. He rubbed the side of his jaw with his hand, looked at the window, looked back at her. "My sister," he said. "Her name was Clara. She was 22. Came out to Wyoming Territory after her husband died and she had nothing. Crowder gave her work." A pause. "She wrote me 3 letters from Blackthorn. First one said the work was hard, but the wages were fair, and she thought she could clear her husband's debt in 2 years, maybe less. Second letter said the numbers had gotten complicated, but she was managing." His voice stayed even. "Third letter said she was scared and she needed me to come." Tamsin didn't say anything. "I rode 3 weeks to get there," he said. "She was gone. Crowder told me she'd left voluntarily, moved on. He said it the way he says everything, comfortable, smiling, like the truth and whatever he was telling you were the same thing." He looked at the ledger. "I didn't believe him. I started asking around and nobody would talk to me because they all worked for him or owed him something. So I found the Territorial Records Office. I broke in." "You broke in?" "I was 29 and I didn't know another way." He shrugged slightly. "I found records that put Clara at Blackthorn up to 3 months before I arrived, and then nothing. No record of her leaving the territory. No death record. Nothing." His jaw worked. "I copied what I had and I kept it, because I didn't trust leaving evidence in a government office that Crowder already had friends in, and then I left before they figured out I'd been in there." Tamsin looked at the ledger, looked at her notes. She found Clara's name before he finished speaking. She had seen it when she was reading and not known whose sister it was. The account was listed as closed, debt forgiven. She moved her Bible page to cover it. "I'm sorry," she said. Rourke stood up from the bed. He moved to the window and looked out at the alley. "The copies I have," he said, "they're cached. Somewhere safe. If what you found in that ledger matches what I've been carrying for 7 years, it will," she said. He turned and looked at her. "It'll match," she said. "The structure is the same, the handwriting is the same. Whatever he did to Clara, he was already doing it before she arrived and he kept doing it after. Your copies and this ledger together," she looked at her notes. "That's not circumstantial, that's a case." Something passed across his face. Not relief exactly. Relief would have been too simple for whatever it was, too clean, too uncomplicated. This was something that had been carried a long time and wasn't going to set down all at once. "We'd need a territorial marshal," he said, "not the county sheriff. Crowder owns the county sheriff." "I know." "And we'd need your witnesses. The people in this book who are still alive and willing to talk." "I know that too." She looked at the columns she'd made. "I think I know where to start." 1. The woman's name was Margaret Holloway. Tamsin had first seen her name in the ledger that morning, recognized it from the Blackthorn kitchen, and had spent part of her walk to Mercy Ridge trying to remember everything she knew about her. Margaret had worked the kitchen for 3 years before Tamsin arrived. The older hands talked about her sometimes, usually fondly, usually with the slight wistfulness of men who remembered good cooking. She had disappeared before Tamsin came to Blackthorn, and Tamsin had been told, as she was told everything on that ranch, only what Crowder decided she needed to know. She'd left voluntarily, moved east. That was the story. Tamsin had seen it before, the same clean erasure. A person simply stops being present and gets replaced with a simple story that nobody questions because questioning costs something, and most people can't afford the cost. A woman in the general store knew something. Tamsin found this out by sitting at Odessa's kitchen table that afternoon, while Odessa made coffee and asking careful questions, not about Margaret specifically, not at first, but about the town, about who had been here long, about whether Blackthorn workers ever settled in Mercy Ridge. Odessa poured coffee into 2 cups without being asked whether Tamsin wanted any, and sat down across the table and said, "Margaret Holloway lives on the Decker Road. Small house, red fence, broken gate, she's been meaning to fix for 2 years." Tamsin looked at her. "She came through here about 6 years back," Odessa said. "Didn't say much about where she'd been. Still doesn't." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I've seen women come through this town in a lot of conditions. Margaret came through looking like someone who'd been running and finally got tired enough to stop. That kind of thing leaves a mark." "Did she ever say anything about Blackthorn?" "She never said the name out loud." Odessa looked at Tamsin's wrists, at the rope marks that hadn't faded yet. "I'm guessing you didn't leave that ranch voluntarily this morning." "I walked out," Tamsin said. "An outlaw walked with me." "Rourke Maddox." "He's the one." Odessa nodded slowly. She sipped her coffee. That man has been riding around this territory for years, looking for a fight with Crowder that he couldn't quite figure out how to start. Every bounty hunter who tried to bring him in gave up because he kept not being where they thought he was and kept turning up where nobody expected. She set the cup down. "What's in the ledger?" Tamsin told her. She didn't tell her everything. She kept Clara's name back, kept Rourke's specific history back. But she laid out the structure, the fabricated charges, the names she'd recognized, the 19 years. When she finished, Obese was quiet for a long moment. "That man," she said finally, "has been pulling this on people since before half this territory was settled." "Yes." "And nobody stopped him." "Nobody had everything in one place before," Tamsin said. "They had pieces. He made sure of that. You keep people isolated. You keep the information isolated. Nobody sees the whole picture." Obese stood up and refilled her own cup and stood at the stove looking out the small window above it. "Margaret Holloway," she said, "if you go to that house, if you walk up to that woman and ask her to tell you what happened at Blackthorn Ranch, you need to understand what you're asking." "I know. You're asking her to pick up something she put down very deliberately, very hard." "I know that too," Tamsin said, "but it's already in motion. Crowder's going to move. If he gets ahead of this before I can get documentation to a territorial marshal, this ledger becomes evidence of theft, and I become a thief, and everything in it becomes inadmissible." She looked at Obese steadily. "I need witnesses. I need people who'll talk, and I need them before the sheriff shows up in this town with a warrant." Obese turned from the window. Her expression was not warm exactly, but it was decided. "I'll take you to Margaret's," she said. "Tonight, after supper. She's more likely to open the door to me than a stranger." The Decker Road was unpaved and narrow, and the evening had turned cold by the time they reached the red fence with the broken gate. A lamp was burning in the front window, smoke from a chimney. The small house had the look of something maintained carefully within limited means. The woodpile stacked neatly, the porch swept, everything in its right place. Obese knocked. A pause. Movement inside. Then the door opened 6 inches, stopped by a chain, and a woman's face appeared in the gap. Mid-40s, brown hair pulled back, eyes that had learned to check who was knocking before they gave anything away. "Obese," she said. Relief briefly. Then her eyes went to Tamsin, and the relief went cautious. "Who's this?" "Her name is Tamsin Vale," Obese said. "She worked Blackthorn Ranch." The door almost closed. Margaret's hand came up to push it and stopped just short. "Tamsin Vale," she said slowly, like she was checking whether she recognized it. "I have his ledger," Tamsin said. She held it up so Margaret could see it in the lamplight through the gap. "His full accounts book. I need you to look at something in it." "Where did you get that?" "I walked out with it this morning. I had help." Margaret's eyes narrowed. She studied Tamsin through the gap, studied her the way people study someone they're trying to decide whether to trust, which is to say, completely, looking for the small things that give a liar away. Tamsin stood still and let herself be looked at. The chain came off. The door opened. Margaret Holloway's kitchen was warm and smelled of the supper she'd already had, something with onions, a pot still sitting on the back of the stove. She poured water into a kettle without asking and set it to heat and stood with her back to them for a moment before she turned around. "Show me," she said. Tamsin opened the ledger to Margaret's pages and laid it on the kitchen table. Margaret looked at it. She didn't reach for it. She stood with her arms at her sides and looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been trying not to think about. "He told people I left voluntarily," she said. "He told everyone that," Tamsin said. "I left because he told me he would ruin my son." Her voice was level in the way of something that had been said inside her head many times and finally found its way out. "My boy was 16, working in Laramie. Crowder said he had contacts, that he could make sure my son never found work in the territory again, that he could have him investigated for any number of things that would... He was very specific about the number of things." She paused. "I signed a document saying I left of my own free will, and I owed nothing and nobody owed me nothing. Then I came here." "Do you still have that document?" Margaret looked at her. "Why?" "Because a coerced signature is not a voluntary one," Tamsin said. "And because if Crowder made you sign that document under threat, that's extortion. That goes on top of the wage fraud, on top of the false accounts, on top of everything else in this book." Margaret looked at the ledger again. Her hand came out and she turned one page slowly and looked at the column of figures that had grown every month while she worked Crowder's kitchen, fabricated charge by fabricated charge. "I knew something was wrong with the numbers," she said quietly. "I wasn't stupid." "No," Tamsin said. "He just made sure you didn't have access to the whole picture." "How many people?" 41 names, that I found." Margaret sat down in her kitchen chair heavily. She put her hands flat on the table on either side of the ledger. "I'll talk," she said. "If it goes to a territorial marshal, if it actually goes somewhere that isn't just—" She stopped. "I've seen things go nowhere before." "So have I," Tamsin said. "This is different." "Why?" Tamsin thought about how to answer that. She thought about the ledger, about Rourke's copies sitting somewhere safe, 7 years of careful preservation. About the 41 names that turned Crowder's comfortable isolation of victims into a pattern too large to dismiss. "Because this time," she said, "there's more than one of us." She was back at Odessa's by 9 o'clock. Rourke was still in the sitting room, which surprised her slightly. She had half expected him to be gone. The way men who operated the way he operated tended to keep moving. He was reading something, or pretending to, and he looked up when she came in. "She'll talk," Tamsin said. Something shifted in his face, briefly. "Good," he said. Tamsin sat down in the other chair. Her feet hurt from the walking, and her wrists still ached, and she was tired in a way that went down into her bones. But her mind was still running, and she knew it wouldn't stop for a while yet. "Crowder will go to the sheriff tonight," she said. "Probably already has." "Probably." "Sheriff Beaumont. I know the name. Crowder mentioned him enough times that it stood out." "Beaumont's been in Crowder's pocket for at least 5 years," Rourke said. "Maybe longer. He'll have a warrant by morning. Theft, most likely. He'll frame it as you and an outlaw conspiring to steal private financial records. And if they come to Mercy Ridge with a warrant, they'll come to Mercy Ridge." He said it plainly, like weather. Tamsin was quiet for a moment. "Then I need to get copies made before they get here," she said. "The ledger, my notes, the full documentation. Separate copies, separate locations. Crowder can't suppress evidence he doesn't know exists." "Odessa has a nephew in the next county," Rourke said. "Runs a print shop. She already mentioned him to me." Tamsin looked at him. "When?" "While you were upstairs going through the book. She seemed to be thinking ahead. She didn't mention it to me." "She was waiting to see how the evening went," Rourke said. "I think you passed whatever test she was running." Tamsin almost smiled at that. Almost. "The copies I keep," Rourke said, and now his voice changed slightly. "I'll ride for them tonight. Bring them back tomorrow. If your documentation and mine together, they'll match," she said again. He looked at her with that same expression she couldn't quite name, the one that appeared when she said something he believed but hadn't expected to. "You don't doubt it," he said. "The structure is too consistent to be coincidence," she said. "Whatever he did to Clara, he did it the same way he did it to Margaret Holloway and Pyotr Vasek and all the rest of them. That's either a very specific kind of bad luck, or it's a method." She looked at the ledger on the table between them. "It's a method, and your copies will show that the method existed before most of the people in this book ever arrived at Blackthorn." Rourke stood up. He put his hand briefly on top of the closed ledger, just for a second, not pressing, just touching it. And then he pulled his coat from the back of the chair. "I'll be back by midday," he said. "Be careful," she said. It came out more natural than she expected. He looked at her. Something in his face moved, quiet and quick. "You too," he said. He was out the door a minute later. Tamsin heard his boots on the step, then nothing. She sat alone in Odessa's sitting room with the ledger in front of her and the lamp burning low and the whole weight of tomorrow pressing against the walls of the room. She opened the ledger again. She still had names she hadn't finished reading. She found Lenora Pike on page 23. The name stopped her. She had heard it once, just once, years ago, from a Blackthorn hand who'd had too much whiskey and too little sense, who had mentioned a woman named Lenora Pike, who used to do the books for Crowder's operation before she turned up, gone one winter, 9 years back. The hand had been hushed immediately by the man sitting next to him, and the name had never come up again, and Tamsin had filed it away in the same mental cabinet where she kept everything at Blackthorn that didn't make sense but couldn't be examined safely. Lenora Pike, former bookkeeper. Missing 9 years. She looked at the account entry. Lenora's wages, Lenora's supposed debts. And then, in Crowder's handwriting, a single notation she hadn't seen on any other page. Do not contact. Do not pursue. Arrangement in place. Tamsin stared at it. Arrangement in place. Not dead. Not account closed like the others who hadn't made it. An arrangement. Lenora Pike was alive somewhere, and Silas Crowder knew where. Tamsin set the ledger down carefully and sat back in her chair. The lamp flame moved slightly in a draft from somewhere. Outside, the town was quiet. She thought about what an arrangement with Silas Crowder looked like for a woman who used to keep his books and had presumably seen enough to destroy him. She thought about what Crowder would do now that his ledger was gone. She thought about how much Lenora Pike might know. And she thought about the fact that if Crowder panicked, and he was panicking, she had seen it in his face in that yard, his first move would not be to find Tamsin. His first move would be to find Lenora. She needed to find Lenora first. She pulled one of her Bible pages toward her and wrote the name at the top. Then she wrote, Arrangement, not dead. Crowder knows where. Crowder. Then she wrote, Find her before he does. She looked at the words. Then she blew out the lamp and sat in the dark, thinking for a long time. She didn't sleep much. That wasn't new. She hadn't slept well in 7 years, not on a bunkhouse cot, with no lock on the door and Crowder's ranch making its noises around her all night. But this was a different kind of wakefulness, not the anxious animal alertness of someone waiting for a threat. Something more purposeful than that. Her mind kept turning over the ledger pages like hands working a problem, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lenora Pike's name and that notation underneath it, arrangement in place. By the time gray light started coming through the window, she had made a list. Not on paper. She had used most of the Bible's blank pages the night before. In her head. An ordered list of what she knew, what she needed, and what had to happen in what sequence for any of this to reach a territorial marshal before Crowder's borrowed sheriff reached Mercy Ridge. She needed Rourke back with his copies. She needed Odessa's nephew to duplicate the ledger. She needed to find Lenora Pike. And she needed all three of those things to happen before Sheriff Beaumont rode into town with a warrant and a story about a thieving ranch woman and a wanted outlaw. Because once that story became the official version, the truth in the ledger became evidence of a crime instead of evidence of one. She got up, washed her face with the cold water in the basin, and went downstairs. Odessa was already in the kitchen. She had coffee going and biscuits in the pan, and she looked at Tamsin coming down the stairs and did not ask how she'd slept, which Tamsin appreciated. Your outlaw isn't back yet, Odessa said. He said midday. It's barely past dawn. Odessa set a cup on the table. Sit. Tamsin sat. She wrapped both hands around the cup and felt the warmth move up through her palms. Outside the kitchen window, Mercy Ridge was waking up in pieces. A door opening somewhere down the block, boots on a wooden step, a horse being led past at a walk. Tell me about Lenora Pike, Tamsin said. Odessa was quiet for a moment. She turned the biscuits without rushing. What do you know already? She asked. Bookkeeper for Crowder. Went missing 9 years ago. Crowder's ledger has a notation on her account. Not closed, not cleared. It says arrangement in place. Tamsin looked at the steam rising from her cup. She's alive. Crowder knows where she is. And whatever arrangement he made with her, he made it because she knew enough to hurt him, and he couldn't just make her disappear the way he did the others. Odessa turned from the stove. She looked at Tamsin for a moment. There's a homestead, she said, about 14 miles north, up near the tree line where the county road turns to gravel. Woman up there keeps mostly to herself. Comes into town twice a year for supplies. Doesn't engage. Doesn't give a name that means anything. She paused. I've done her shopping twice when she sent a list with a passing rider, handwriting like someone who was educated more than she lets on. Tamsin looked at her. I don't know her name, Odessa said carefully, but I've been curious about her for about 9 years. Rourke came back at 11:15. He came in through the back, which Tamsin had begun to understand was simply how he moved through the world, avoiding the obvious entrance on principle, not out of paranoia, but out of a long habit of not being where people expected him to be. He set a leather satchel on Odessa's kitchen table and opened it. Inside were documents, folded, careful, preserved with the deliberateness of someone who understood what they were keeping and why. Some were originals on territorial paper. Some were copies in Rourke's own handwriting, dense and careful. All of it dated from 7 years back, some from earlier. Tamsin spread them across the table beside her notes. For 10 minutes, neither of them spoke. She read. He watched her read. Here, she said finally. She put her finger on a document, a territorial registration of labor contract for a woman named Clara Maddox, signed and witnessed, the terms written out in Crowder's characteristic hand. Same structure, same fabricated surcharges, different label. He called it Accommodation Enhancement Levy on this one. He changes the name, Rourke said, keeps the same formula. Because the name is what people see first. If it sounds official, most people don't look further. She moved to another document. This one predates Clara by 3 years. Different worker, same levy, different name again. She sat back. He's been refining it. The version he used on me was cleaner than this. Fewer words, harder to question. Rourke's expression was controlled in a way that cost him something. She could see that. His hands were flat on the table on either side of the documents, and he was looking at his sister's contract with the particular stillness of a man keeping himself from doing something he couldn't take back. Rourke, she said. He looked up. This is enough to establish the pattern, she said. Your copies plus the ledger. That's not a single victim with a grievance. That's a documented system going back almost 2 decades. A territorial marshal can't look at this and call it a misunderstanding. If we can get it to a territorial marshal, that's the job now. She started organizing the documents into 2 piles. I need these copied before anything else. Today. Odessa's nephew, he can do it. I already talked to him this morning, on the ride back. Rourke pulled his chair in. He's got a press and the paper for it. He'll need the afternoon. He'll have it. She looked at the window. But I need to go north first. There's a homestead 14 miles up. A woman Odessa thinks might be Lenora Pike. Rourke was quiet. If Lenora was Crowder's bookkeeper, Tamsin continued, she didn't just know about the fabricated charges. She built the system with him, or she watched him build it, or she kept the real accounts underneath the false ones. She knows where the money actually went. That's not just corroboration. That's the inside of the machine. And Crowder knows she's there, Rourke said. He made an arrangement with her, which means he's kept it as long as the arrangement still served him. She looked at him steadily. The moment he realizes his ledger is gone and that someone is putting the pieces together, the arrangement changes. She becomes a liability. Rourke stood up. I'll go. We'll go, Tamsin said. She's going to open a door to a stranger with a horse and a reputation and nothing else about as readily as she'll fly to the moon. I have the ledger. I have her page. She needs to see that I know what I'm talking about before she says a word. He considered that. He didn't argue it, which she appreciated. 2 hours up, 2 back, he said. That puts us here by dark. If she talks. The county road north was exactly what Odessa had described. Functional until the gravel started, and then it was more suggestion than road, a pair of ruts through scrub pine that required the horse to pick its way carefully. Tamsin rode behind Rourke on the big bay, one hand on the ledger, one on the back of the saddle, not holding on to him because she didn't need to. She had ridden behind men on working horses all her adult life, and she knew how to distribute her weight. The horse didn't seem to mind her, neither did Rourke for that matter. He had not made a single comment about the weight of 2 people on one horse, not even the careful, considerate kind that was still a comment. He just adjusted the pace slightly and rode. She found herself thinking, not for the first time since that morning in the yard, about what kind of man simply did that. Walked into a situation, put himself between a woman and an iron, and then proceeded to treat the woman as a person who could manage her own thinking, not as a project, not as a debt he was collecting on, just as a person. She filed that observation away without examining it further. There wasn't time. The homestead came into view through the trees, a small house, well built, with a vegetable garden on the south side, still showing the last of the season's growth. Firewood stacked high along the east wall. A single horse in a small paddock. Smoke from the chimney, thin and steady. Rourke pulled up at the tree line. You take the door, he said quietly. I'll stay with the horse. If she sees me first, she's going to think Crowder sent someone. Tamsin swung down, straightened her coat, took the ledger under her arm. If she runs, she said, which direction is she likely to go? North, into the trees. Better cover. Then let's hope she doesn't run. She walked up to the door and knocked. Silence. The kind of silence that means someone is on the other side of it, listening. My name is Tamsin Vale, she said clearly. I worked Silas Crowder's ranch for 7 years. I walked out yesterday morning with his ledger. I have your page. A long pause. I know you're there, Tamsin said. I know about the arrangement. I'm not here to break it. I'm here because Crowder is going to break it himself as soon as he understands what I took from him. Another pause. Shorter. The door opened. Lenora Pike was 53 years old and looked like a woman who had made a deliberate decision to be invisible and had kept at it with considerable discipline. No ornamentation, hair pulled back without vanity, eyes that were sharp and tired in equal measure, with the particular expression of someone who had spent years watching a door and was accustomed to not liking what came through it. She looked at Tamsin, looked past her at Rourke standing by the tree line, looked back at Tamsin. Come in, she said. Not warm, not hostile, measured. The inside of the house was ordered, not comfortable exactly, but organized with a precision that spoke to someone who needed control over at least one small part of the world. A desk against the north wall. Papers in stacks. An open ledger of her own, which she closed when Tamsin came in. Tamsin set Crowder's ledger on the table and opened it to Lenora's page. Lenora looked at it from where she stood, 6 feet away. She didn't move closer. He told me he'd burn that, she said. He didn't. Clearly. She finally moved to the table. She looked at the page, at her own wages, her fabricated debts, the notation at the bottom. Her expression was difficult to read, not because she had no reaction, but because she had practiced not showing the ones she had. What did he threaten you with? Tamsin asked. Lenora looked up. Something moved across her face. My daughter, she said. She was 14. Living with my sister in Cheyenne. He said, she stopped, started again. He said he had reach in Cheyenne, that my sister's husband had debts of his own, that a word in the right ear could make life very complicated for all of them. She looked at the ledger. He said if I stayed quiet and stayed far away and didn't speak to anyone about anything I'd seen in his books, he'd leave them alone. And your daughter? She's 23 now, married, living in Colorado. She doesn't know any of this. Lenora's voice held. And I've been on this homestead for 9 years making sure it stays that way. Tamsin sat down in the chair across from her, not performing anything, just sitting. I need to know what you know, she said. Not the arrangement you made with him, what you actually know. What you saw when you kept his books. Lenora was quiet for a long time. The real accounts, she said finally, are not in that ledger. Tamsin went still. That book is the operational record, Lenora continued. The day-to-day, the fabricated charges, the worker accounts. What's in there would be enough to show the fraud, but it wouldn't show where the money went. She paused. Crowder keeps a second book. He kept it locked in a box under the floorboards of his private office. I never had direct access to it, but I prepared the transfers that fed into it. Transfers to where? 3 accounts. One in Casper, one in Denver, one in a bank in Santa Fe under a name I didn't recognize. He had me process payments from the ranch general accounts to holding accounts, and then the holding accounts moved the money further. She looked at her hands on the table. I didn't understand the full structure until I'd been doing it for almost 2 years. By the time I understood what I was participating in, I had participated in enough that he owned me. You kept records, Tamsin said. She said it because she was looking at the desk, at the papers in careful stacks, at the closed ledger Lenora had shut when she came in. Lenora looked at her for a moment. I kept records, she confirmed. Everything I could reconstruct from memory in the first year I was here, before it faded. Account numbers, approximate amounts, transfer dates, the name on the Santa Fe account. She paused. I didn't know what to do with them. I had nobody to give them to, and no way to give them safely. You have someone now, Tamsin said. They stayed 2 hours. Lenora talked, and Tamsin listened and wrote, using the back of one of the ledger's inside covers because she had run out of other paper, writing in her small, precise hand while Lenora laid out 9 years of remembered detail with the careful accuracy of someone who had been keeping it all contained and was now finally letting it out in controlled release. It was not an easy 2 hours. Lenora stopped several times. Not from unwillingness, but from the particular difficulty of describing things that she had spent years not describing, that had stayed alive in her memory precisely because she had never spoken them out loud. Speaking them gave them a different kind of weight. Rourke came in after the first hour and sat near the door without being invited and without being turned away. He didn't speak. He listened. When Lenora described the structure of the transfer accounts, he asked one question. Was the Denver account in the name of a business or an individual? And when she told him, he nodded once and went back to listening. When they were done, Lenora produced a flat wooden box from under the desk. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were her records, pages of careful handwriting, organized by date, covering the period from her first year at Blackthorn through her last week there. She held the box for a moment before handing it over. "My daughter cannot be touched," she said. She said it looking at Tamsin, not Rourke. "Whatever this becomes, wherever it goes, that is the condition." "I'll do everything I can," Tamsin said. "That's not sufficient." "No," Tamsin agreed. "It isn't, but it's what I have. And it's honest." Lenora looked at her for a long time. Then she handed over the box. "Yeah." They made it back to Mercy Ridge by 4 in the afternoon, and the first thing Tamsin saw when they came down the main street was the look on the face of the boy sweeping outside the general store. The particular look of someone who had seen something and wasn't sure whether to say so. Rourke saw it too. He pulled the horse up slowly. "Something happened," he said quietly. The boy looked at them. He was maybe 15, gap-toothed, with the expression of someone processing a civic duty. "Sheriff's deputy came through," he said. "About an hour ago. Just the one. He asked around about a big woman and a man on a dark horse." "Did he go to Odessa's?" Tamsin asked. "He went to Odessa's. She told him she hadn't seen anyone matching that description." The boy paused. He didn't look like he entirely believed her, but he didn't push it, left heading back south. "Just the one deputy," Rourke said. "Just the one." Rourke looked at Tamsin. She looked back at him. "Crowder's testing the ground," she said. "Sending one man to see if we're here and whether anyone will give us up. The warrant isn't ready yet." "Or Beaumont's more careful than I gave him credit for," Rourke said. "He sends one deputy. The deputy comes back with nothing. Nobody can say the sheriff was involved. How long do we have?" "A day. Maybe less." He dismounted and took the horse's reins. "Is the copying done?" "Odessa's nephew has been at it all afternoon," she said. "Should be finished by evening." "Then we move tonight." Tamsin looked down the empty street. The deputy was gone. The boy had gone back to his sweeping. Mercy Ridge sat in the late afternoon light, looking like nothing had happened and nothing was about to. "Move to where?" she said. "Territorial Marshal's office," Rourke said. "Closest one is in Casper, 40 miles. 40 miles with a ledger, Lenora's records, your copies, and Margaret Holloway's testimony." "Margaret needs to travel with us," Rourke said. "A witness who stays here gets pressured or disappeared before she can testify. She has her son to think about." "I know." He tied the horse at the post and looked at her. "Will she come?" Tamsin thought about the woman who had unlatched the chain on her door and sat in her own kitchen describing the worst years of her life with her hands flat on the table. She thought about Margaret's voice when she said, "I knew something was wrong with the numbers." The particular exhaustion of a person who had been right and had known they were right and had not been able to do anything about it for years. "I think she's been waiting for a reason to stop hiding," Tamsin said. "I'll ask her." She asked her at 5 o'clock, sitting in Margaret's kitchen again, while the lamp burned and the pot on the stove put out its steady warmth. She laid it out plainly, where they were going, why, what the risks were, what the alternative was if Crowder got ahead of the evidence. Margaret listened without interrupting. "If I travel with you," she said when Tamsin finished, "and something goes wrong, if Beaumont catches up with us on the road, if Crowder has more reach in Casper than you think, then we're in trouble," Tamsin said. "I won't tell you otherwise." "And if I stay here?" "Crowder knows Margaret Holloway left Blackthorn under duress. That document you signed, the coerced one, he's kept it, which means he also knows it could be challenged. If this investigation starts moving, you become a loose end whether you participated or not." Margaret looked at her hands. "My son," she said. "Does he know where you are?" "He knows I'm in Wyoming territory. He doesn't know the town." "Then as long as we move before Crowder moves,
Your son is safe. Tamsin paused. He doesn't have leverage on your son the way he had it when you were at Blackthorn. That was fear of a threat. You've been living on that fear for 6 years. It kept you here, and it kept you quiet, and it served him perfectly. Margaret looked up. It's not serving you, Tamsin said, quietly, without pressure. A long silence. Then, what time do we leave?
They left at 9 o'clock, in the dark, which was Rourke's preference, and Tamsin had no argument with it. Odessa's nephew had finished the copies and delivered them in a bundle wrapped in oilskin, and Tamsin had separated everything into 3 packets. The original ledger in one set of copies with Lenora's records, 1 set of copies with Rourke's documents from the Territorial office. She gave the 3rd packet to Odessa. If we don't reach Casper, she said, get this to the nearest Territorial office that isn't in Beaumont's county. Odessa took it without drama. Come back and get it yourself. That's the plan. Rourke had borrowed a 2nd horse from the livery, paid for it actually, which surprised Tamsin until she remembered that a wanted outlaw who steals horses on top of everything else is a wanted outlaw with compounding problems. Margaret wrote it. She was a competent writer, which helped. Lenora had declined to travel. Tamsin had gone back to the homestead before dark and asked, and Lenora had said no, not from fear, but from the logic of it. Her records were already in Tamsin's hands. Her testimony could be taken in writing, signed, and witnessed, which she prepared that afternoon. Traveling 40 miles to Casper with a warrant potentially behind them was a risk she was unwilling to add to the risk she had already taken. Tamsin understood. She accepted the signed statement and left. So it was 3 of them on the road north, Tamsin and Rourke and Margaret, moving at a pace that was not fast but was steady, on a road that was empty and dark under a sky with enough stars to navigate by. They had been riding for about an hour when Rourke said quietly, "We're being followed." Tamsin didn't turn around. "How many?" "1, maybe 2, about a quarter mile back. They've been staying at the same distance since we left town." Margaret made a small sound. "They're not moving to overtake," Rourke said. "They're tracking." "Beaumont's deputy," Tamsin said. "He didn't go south. He waited. Or someone from Blackthorn who saw us come back and put a rider on the road while we were packing." He paused. "Either way, they're going to know our heading." "Which means Crowder knows before morning." "Yes," Tamsin thought. The road to Casper was not complex. There were not many alternatives. If Crowder knew they were heading north, he could send riders on a faster route and have men waiting. He had the money for it, and the men for it, and she needed to stop pretending that the distance between them and a territorial marshal was just physical. "Is there another route?" she asked. "Longer, goes east through the basin and then north, adds half a day." "But he won't know to block it." "Not tonight." Rourke looked at the road ahead. "We'd need to cut east in the next mile, before whoever's behind us sees the turn." "Then we cut east," Tamsin said. Margaret said nothing. She just shifted her weight on the borrowed horse and followed when Rourke took the turn. The longer route was harder going. The basin road was rougher, less traveled, and in the dark it required a slower pace than any of them wanted. But nobody followed. The quarter-mile presence behind them vanished when they took the eastern cut, and after an hour without sign of pursuit, Rourke's shoulders settled slightly, which was about as close to visible relief as he seemed to get. They stopped around midnight at a stream crossing to water the horses. Margaret got down and sat on a rock and rubbed her knees. She was 50 years old and not accustomed to long night rides, and she didn't complain about it, which Tamsin noted and respected. Rourke took the horses to the water and Tamsin stood on the bank and looked at the darkness north of them and thought about Casper, about the Territorial Marshal's office, about what it would look like to walk in there with everything she was carrying. She thought about Crowder standing in his yard that morning, watching her walk out, the calculation going wrong behind his eyes. She had been on the road for over 30 hours. She was tired in a way that went past the body into something more fundamental. But the thing she kept coming back to, the thing that stayed clear even when everything else was blurring at the edges, was that nobody had done this before because nobody had ever had all of it in one place. 41 names, 19 years, Lenora's records, Rourke's copies, Margaret's testimony, all of it in one place, moving north through the dark. "He's going to fight this," Margaret said from her rock. She wasn't asking. "Yes," Tamsin said. "He's going to say you stole it. He's going to say Rourke put you up to it. He's going to say, I have a grudge. She looked at the water. He's good at making the story about the person telling the truth instead of the truth itself.
I know, Tamsin said. That's what men like him do. So how do you stop it? Tamsin turned and looked at her. At this woman who had come off her rock and away from her broken gate and her careful invisible life and gotten on a borrowed horse in the dark because something had finally shifted far enough.
You make the evidence so complete that the story can't fit around it anymore, Tamsin said. He can say whatever he wants about me. He can say I'm bitter, and I'm a thief, and I'm a fat woman with an outlaw boyfriend and a grudge. He can say all of it. She held up the packet under her arm. But he can't say his own handwriting is a lie. He can't say Lenore's account numbers don't exist. He can't say you signed that coercion document voluntarily when the coercion is documented in the same hand that signed the contract. Margaret was quiet. The evidence has to be bigger than the story, Tamsin said. That's what we're carrying. Rourke came back with the horses. He looked at both of them, reading whatever was in the air. Ready? He said. Yes, they both said. Not quite simultaneously. Close enough. They mounted and went back to the road. The stream crossed behind them, and the darkness opened up ahead, and the stars were very clear this far from any town. Tamsin kept the packet against her chest where the warmth of her own body could reach it. She was thinking about Casper. She was thinking about the look on Silas Crowder's face when the calculation went wrong. She was thinking that she had spent 7 years on his ranch believing the numbers were fixed against her, and she had been right about that, and she had been right about everything she suspected, and she had been so careful and so correct for so long in complete isolation with nobody believing her. Now the numbers were in her hands, and she was 40 miles from a man with the authority to use them. She rode north. Behind them, in the dark, Blackthorn Basin sat quiet and ignorant of what was moving away from it. Silas Crowder would learn by morning. But morning was still a few hours away. They reached the outskirts of Casper at 10:30 the following morning. It had taken longer than 40 miles should have taken. The Eastern Basin route added distance, and the horses needed rest, and Margaret needed an hour of actual sleep somewhere around 3 in the morning, which they took in the shelter of a rock overhang with Rourke keeping watch and Tamsin sitting upright against the stone wall with the packet in her lap, dozing in intervals, startling awake every time the wind changed. Nobody came after them on the eastern route. Whether that was luck or whether Crowder's rider had lost them at the turn and reported back wrong, she didn't know. She wasn't going to call it good fortune until she was inside a Territorial Marshal's office with the evidence on a table in front of a man with actual authority. Casper was bigger than Mercy Ridge by a significant degree. Wide streets, a proper hotel, a courthouse building with territorial flags, commerce that moved with the specific confidence of a town that considered itself the center of something. Tamsin had been here twice in 7 years, both times on Crowder's ranch business, both times accompanied by his men, both times with no reason to notice where the marshal's office was. She noticed now. It was on the east side of the main street, brick-fronted, with a territorial seal above the door. 2 horses at the rail outside. A deputy visible through the window, sitting at a desk. Rourke pulled up half a block short. "I don't go in," he said. Tamsin looked at him. "I walk in there," he said, "and the first conversation is about me. Not the ledger, not Crowder. Me. Whether I'm under arrest, whether the warrants are still active, who I am, and why I'm here, and what kind of deal I'm looking for." He kept his eyes on the office door. "Crowder's already planning to use my name against this. I walk in with you. I hand him that argument before you've had a chance to speak." She wanted to say he was wrong. She couldn't because he wasn't. "You can't stay on the street," she said. "If Crowder has anyone in Casper, I won't be on the street." He looked at her then, something in his face that was not quite worry but lived near it. "You can do this without me in that room." "I know I can," she said. That wasn't the part she was thinking about. Margaret had pulled up alongside them and was listening without comment, which Tamsin had come to understand was simply how Margaret processed things. Quietly, completely, without wasting words on the parts that didn't need them. "There's a hardware store 2 blocks north," Margaret said. "We passed it coming in. He can wait there." Rourke looked at her. Something passed between them, 2 people who had an agreement. "Hardware store," he said. 2 hours. "Give us 3, Tamsin said. "If this goes the way it should, 3 hours is not enough. If it goes wrong—" She stopped. If it goes wrong, don't wait. His jaw tightened slightly. Tamsin, I mean it. If Crowder has reach here and this marshal is the wrong man, the evidence still exists. Odessa has a packet. You know what's in it. You get out and you find another way. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him without flinching because she meant it. Not as bravado, not as a speech, but as a practical instruction from a woman who had been making practical decisions under difficult circumstances for 7 years and had not stopped. 3 hours, he said finally. She swung down from the horse, straightened her coat, tucked the main packet under her arm. Ledger, her notes, Lenora's records, Rourke's copies, Margaret's written statement, and her own account of events since sunrise yesterday, which she had drafted on the road in the gray pre-dawn light using a pencil stub she'd borrowed from Odessa's kitchen. Ready? She said to Margaret. No, Margaret said, and got down from the horse. But let's go anyway. The deputy at the desk looked up when they came in. He was young, mid-20s, clean-shaven, with the expression of a man who had not yet had enough things happen to him to make him interesting. He looked at Tamsin, then at Margaret, then at the packet under Tamsin's arm. Help you? He said. I need to speak to the Territorial Marshal, Tamsin said. Not a deputy, the Marshal himself. Marshal Greaves is, I have documentary evidence of 19 years of fraudulent labor contracts, wage theft, extortion, bribery of a county sheriff, and unlawful confinement of workers in Blackthorn Basin, Tamsin said. She said it at a normal conversational volume, clearly, the way she might describe a weather pattern. I have original documents, authenticated copies, the account book of the man who ran the scheme, the testimony of 2 surviving victims, and financial records kept by his former bookkeeper detailing the movement of stolen funds across 3 territorial jurisdictions. She set the packet on the deputy's desk. I'll wait while you get him. The deputy stared at the packet. Then he stood up and went through the inner door without another word. Margaret sat down in the chair against the wall. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the floor and breathed carefully, the way a person breathes when they are holding something together by the effort of respiration alone. You all right? Tamsin said quietly. I will be, Margaret said. Ask me again in an hour. The inner door opened and a man came through, 50 or so, thick through the chest, gray at the temples, with the particular bearing of someone who had been making decisions under pressure long enough that it had become his resting state. He looked at the packet on the desk. He looked at Tamsin. Marshal Greaves, he said. He did not offer his hand, which was fine. She wasn't here for pleasantries. Tamsin Vale, she said. I worked Blackthorn Ranch in Blackthorn Basin under Silas Crowder for 7 years under a fraudulent labor contract. I walked out yesterday morning with his primary accounts ledger. I've spent the last 36 hours gathering corroborating documentation. She gestured at the packet. I'd like to lay it out for you. Greaves looked at her for a moment. He was assessing her the way a careful man assesses, not dismissively, but thoroughly, looking for the things she might be hiding behind the things she was saying. Come into my office, he said. It took 2.5 hours. Tamsin laid everything out on Greaves's table in the order she had organized it. The ledger first, open to the systematic charge structure, then her own annotated notes mapping the pattern across accounts, then Rourke's copies with their earlier dates establishing the timeline, then Lenora's records with the financial transfer information and account numbers, then Margaret's signed statement and Lenora's signed testimony, then Tamsin's own written account of events from the previous morning. She walked him through it piece by piece. She did not editorialize. She did not perform outrage. She let the numbers do what numbers do when they are presented clearly to a man who knows how to read them, which Greaves did. He had been a territorial marshal for 11 years, and he had seen land fraud and cattle fraud and contract fraud, and she could tell from the way he moved through the ledger pages, the slight quickening of attention when he reached the transfer records, that he was seeing what she needed him to see. He asked questions. Good ones. Specific, technical, aimed at the gaps she might have expected him to probe. How had she accessed the ledger? What was the chain of custody for Rourke's copies? Could Lenora Pike testify in person or only by written statement? Was Margaret Holloway's coercion document still in Crowder's possession or had it been reproduced? Tamsin answered everything she could answer and said plainly when she couldn't. She did not guess. She did not round the edges of things she was uncertain about. She had learned in 7 years of disputing numbers with Crowder That the moment you overstated a case, you handed your opponent the rope to hang you with, and she was not going to hand Silas Crowder anything she didn't have to. At one point, Greaves put down a page and looked at her. "You organized all of this," he said. "Since yesterday morning." "Yes." "On the road to Casper." "I had the ledger since yesterday. I had time to think on the walk to Mercy Ridge. The copies and additional documents came together through the day." She met his eyes. "I've been doing this arithmetic in my head for 2 years. Having the actual book made it faster." He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up the next page. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the table. "Silas Crowder," he said. "Yes." "Crowder has had dealings with this office before. 4 years ago, there was a complaint from a family named Crow. You have them in this ledger. The complaint didn't go forward because the family retracted it before we could take statements." He paused. "Now I'm wondering how that retraction happened." "I imagine Crowder helped it along," Tamsin said. "I imagine he did." Greaves straightened the pages in front of him with a slight deliberateness that meant he was making decisions. "I'll need to send a rider to the county seat before I can issue territorial warrants. I'll also need to contact the Casper District Judge to authorize the warrant for Crowder's arrest, independent of Sheriff Beaumont's jurisdiction, given your allegation of Beaumont's involvement." "How long?" Tamsin said. "Rider to the county seat and back, this afternoon if I send him now. Judge Harrison is in town this week. I can have the warrants drafted by evening." He looked at her. "You'll need to make a formal statement, both of you." He glanced at Margaret. "And I'll need to send deputies to Blackthorn Basin tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight, before Crowder has time to move evidence or personnel." "He's already moving," Tamsin said. "He sent a deputy to Mercy Ridge yesterday looking for us. He knows we're heading somewhere with what we have." "Then we move faster than he does." Greaves stood. He picked up the packet, carefully, with both hands, the way a man handles something he understands has value. "I'm going to lock this in my safe while you give your statements. The originals stay here. You'll be given receipts." Tamsin nodded. "Miss Vale," Greaves said. He paused. She looked at him. "This is thorough work." "Thank you," she said, without performance. She meant it as a plain acknowledgement of a plain fact, which was how he had said it. He went out to send his rider. They were still in the marshal's office, giving formal statements when the commotion started on the main street. Tamsin heard it before she saw it. Raised voices, then a single shout, then the sound of multiple horses coming fast. The deputy at the outer desk went to the window and looked out and said something she didn't catch. Greaves came back into the room with his expression changed. "Crowder's men," he said. 6 of them, coming down Main Street. Crowder himself at the front. Tamsin stood up. Margaret stood up a second later. "He made better time than I thought," Tamsin said. "He would have ridden through the night," Greaves said. He moved to the door and opened it and called for his deputy. "He's going to come in here and demand the ledger back. He'll have a story ready." "He'll say I stole it," Tamsin said. "He'll have paperwork. He'll cite Beaumont's warrant." "Beaumont's warrant doesn't run in my jurisdiction," Greaves said, and his voice had taken on a specific quality. The quality of a man who has been a territorial officer for 11 years and is no longer reasoning, but acting. "Stay in here." He went outside. Tamsin did not stay in there. She went to the window. Crowder came down the main street of Casper on a gray horse, sitting it with the comfort of a man who owned things and wanted people to know it. He was dressed better than she had seen him in the ranch yard. A coat that cost money, a hat that was new, the deliberate presentation of respectability. Behind him rode 6 men, not all of them ranch hands. 2 looked like hired muscle, the kind that comes with money and no other affiliation. He pulled up in front of the marshal's office and dismounted and said something to Greaves on the step. Tamsin couldn't hear it through the glass, but she could read the shape of it, cordial, confident, the tone of a man who had arrived to clear up a misunderstanding caused by a hysterical employee. Greaves said something back. Crowder's cordiality developed a hairline crack. He said something else, reached inside his coat and produced papers. The warrant, presumably, bearing Beaumont's seal. Greaves looked at the papers, looked at Crowder, said something short. Crowder's expression shifted into the thing that lived under the smiling, the harder thing, the thing Tamsin had seen in the yard when she walked out, the recalculating thing. Margaret appeared at Tamsin's shoulder, looking out the same window. He came himself, Margaret said quietly.
He didn't send men. He came himself.
He's scared, Tamsin said. She said it and understood it as she said it. Silas Crowder, who had run 60 men on his ranch and owned a county sheriff and kept a system running for 19 years, had ridden through the night to Casper because he was scared. Not of the law. He had handled the law before. Scared of the ledger. Scared of what was in it. Scared of what it looked like when it was all in one place in someone else's hands. The door opened and Greaves came back in. He wants the ledger, Greaves said. He's claiming it was removed from his property without authorization. He has Beaumont's warrant for theft. And, Tamsin said, and I told him the ledger is currently evidence in an active territorial investigation and is not available for return pending resolution of the investigation. Greaves moved behind his desk. He's not happy. Is he going to make a scene? He's considering it. Greaves looked out the window at Crowder, still on the step, talking to one of the men he'd brought. He's also considering that he's in Casper, not Blackthorn Basin, and I have 4 deputies inside this building, and the Casper town marshal is 20 yards down the street. He sat down. He's going to be smart about it. He's going to go to Judge Harrison. Can Harrison override you? Not on an active investigation, not without cause, and not today. He picked up his pen. Finish your statement, Miss Vale. I need everything you've told me in writing before evening. Tamsin sat back down. She pulled the paper toward her. She could see Crowder through the window, still on the step, still talking, still calculating. And she made herself look at the paper instead of him, because the statement was more important than watching him think. She wrote. She was 3 pages into her statement when the door opened and the deputy said, in the careful voice of someone delivering unwelcome news to a superior, Marshal, Mr. Crowder has gone to Judge Harrison's chambers. Greaves set down his pen. Expected. How long ago? 5 minutes. Greaves looked at the clock on his wall. He looked at the packet in his safe. He looked at Tamsin. Harrison is a careful judge, he said. Not to her specifically, to the room. He won't issue anything without reading the substance. That takes time. He paused. But Crowder is going to tell him that the warrant from Beaumont's office takes precedence and that we are holding illegally obtained property. Which gives Harrison reason to at least hear him, Tamsin said. Yes. How long do we have before Harrison decides anything? An hour, maybe 2. Greaves stood up. I need to go to Harrison myself, before Crowder gets his version established as the starting point. He looked at his deputy. Stay with them. Nobody comes in without my say. He took the packet from the safe. He paused. You have the copies, he said to Tamsin. In 3 separate locations, she said, including one I don't have access to from this room. Something that might have been approval crossed his face. He went out. Well, the hour that followed was the hardest kind of waiting. The kind where you can see the edges of the outcome, but not the middle. And the middle is where everything that matters happens. Tamsin finished her statement. Margaret finished hers. The deputy brought them water and then stood by the door saying nothing, which was fine. There was nothing useful to say. At some point, Tamsin became aware that she had not eaten anything since the biscuit Odessa had given her the morning before. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the ache in her wrists, steadily, in the background, not important enough to act on. An hour and 20 minutes after Greaves left, he came back. He came back alone, which told her one thing. He came back without the particular set of his jaw that would have meant bad news, which told her another. Harrison reviewed the documentation, he said. He set the packet on the desk. He's declined to honor Beaumont's warrant pending completion of the territorial investigation. He also issued a hold on any county-level legal proceedings related to this matter until the territorial case is resolved. Tamsin let out a breath. Just one, controlled. Crowder, she said. Crowder was in the room. Greaves sat down. He made his arguments. Harrison listened. He paused. There was a moment, and I want to be honest with you about this, when Harrison asked how the ledger came to be in your possession, and Crowder said you had conspired with a wanted criminal to steal private financial records. Harrison asked me whether there was a wanted criminal involved. Tamsin looked at him steadily. I told him there was a man who had provided corroborating documents from 7 years ago that matched the ledger entries, and that man's legal situation was a separate matter from the evidentiary value of his documents, Greaves said. Harrison accepted that. A pause. For now. If Rourke Maddox becomes formally connected to this case in a public way, Crowder will use it at every opportunity. Rourke knows that, Tamsin said. He's known it since the beginning. Does he know it enough to stay out of sight while we execute the warrants? Ask him yourself, Tamsin said. He should be at the hardware store 2 blocks north. They found Rourke where he said he'd be. Not inside the hardware store, because he was not a man who waited inside enclosed spaces when he had the option of a position with sight lines, but outside it, against the wall on the shadowed side, watching the street. He had seen Crowder's arrival. He had watched the 6 men and the gray horse and made the same assessments Tamsin had made, and he was standing very still in the way of someone who has decided not to do something and is holding that decision firmly. Greaves walked up to him directly. They stood looking at each other, the Territorial Marshal and the man whose warrants were active in at least 2 counties, with the particular alertness of 2 people who understood each other's position completely. Maddox, Greaves said. Marshal, Rourke said. The documents you provided, Greaves said. The territorial records you copied 7 years ago from the Rawlins office. I need to know everything about how you obtained them and what happened to the originals. I broke a window, Rourke said, took copies, left the originals in the office. I wasn't there to destroy evidence. I was there to find it. Why didn't you bring it to a territorial office at the time? Because Crowder had already made contact in that office. I'd spent 3 weeks trying to find my sister, and every official I talked to told me there was nothing to investigate. One of them told me specifically that Crowder was a well-respected member of the community, and I should consider whether my grief was affecting my judgment. His voice stayed level. It cost him something. I decided to hold the copies until I found someone with enough pieces that mine would matter. You found her, Greaves said. She found the ledger, Rourke said. I just happened to be in the yard. Greaves looked at him for another moment. I have warrants going out to Blackthorn Basin tonight, he said. Riders leave at dusk. I'll need you not to be on the road between here and there. I understand. I'll also need a formal statement from you, here, tomorrow morning. He paused. After which I will need to address the outstanding warrants against you in Converse County and Carbon County, which I cannot simply set aside regardless of your cooperation with this investigation. Rourke didn't flinch. I know. The charges related to the break-in at the Rawlins office, trespassing, theft of government records, are serious. The fact that you preserved those records and used them to support a legitimate investigation is a mitigating circumstance, not an exculpatory one. I understand the difference, Rourke said. Greaves studied him. Come to this office at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Don't run tonight. Rourke looked at him. Something passed across his face. Not quite surprise, but the thing adjacent to it. I won't run, he said. Greaves walked back toward his office without another word. By evening, Greaves had 4 deputies riding south toward Blackthorn Basin with territorial warrants for Silas Crowder's arrest and authorization to secure the ranch's records, premises, and assets pending investigation. A 5th rider went with a separate warrant for Sheriff Beaumont. Tamsin stood on the boardwalk outside the marshal's office and watched them go. The street was quiet. Crowder had taken his men and gone somewhere, to the hotel, presumably, or to find a lawyer, or both. He was not done. She knew that. A man like Crowder did not simply stop because the law was moving against him. He had money, and he had contacts, and he had 19 years of practice at making problems disappear. But the deputies were riding, and the ledger was in Greaves's safe, and somewhere in 3 separate locations were copies that Crowder didn't know the full extent of. Margaret came out and stood beside her. It's moving, Margaret said, like she was testing whether it was real. It's moving, Tamsin confirmed. Do you think he'll run before the deputies get there? I think he'll try. Tamsin watched the last rider disappear around the corner at the south end of the street. But he'd have to move faster than territorial warrants, and he'd have to move without his money. His accounts are going to be flagged by morning. Running with whatever cash he has on hand is not the same as running with an empire. Margaret was quiet for a moment. What about the people still at Blackthorn? She asked. The 8 names you recognized in the book. Still working. Tamsin had been thinking about that since the morning. The 8 workers still carrying fraudulent debts. Still on the ranch. Still inside Crowder's system. The warrants cover unlawful confinement, she said. Greaves said the deputies have instructions to interview all current workers and inform them of their legal status. She paused. It doesn't fix 7 years overnight, but they'll know. They'll know the debt isn't real. Margaret nodded slowly. Rourke appeared from down the street. He had found food somewhere. He was carrying a paper-wrapped parcel, and he handed it to Tamsin without comment. She didn't ask what was in it. She opened it and found cornbread and salt pork, slightly cold, and she ate it standing on the boardwalk because she was hungry, and she was tired, and there was no reason not to. Harrison's decision holds? Rourke asked. For now, she said between bites. Greaves says Crowder will file challenges. He'll argue in the circuit court. He'll write letters to territorial administrators. He'll do everything available to a man with money and lawyers. She looked at the street. But the warrants are out, and the investigation is officially open. And Crowder doing all of that while under active investigation is very different from Crowder doing it before anyone was looking. Rourke leaned against the post beside her. The evening had come down over Casper. Lamplit windows, the smell of wood smoke, a piano starting up somewhere inside the hotel 2 blocks over. The ordinary texture of a town that did not know what had been set in motion today inside the brick-fronted building behind them. My statement tomorrow, Rourke said. The charges they're going to address. Greaves is a fair man, Tamsin said. I think he sees the difference between what you did and why. Seeing the difference and dismissing the charges are not the same thing. No, she said. They're not. She looked at him. I'll be in that office with you tomorrow. Everything I can say about the value of your documents, about your sister, about what you tried to do 7 years ago when nobody would help you, I'll say it. He looked at her for a moment. The lamp from the marshal's office reached far enough to catch the side of his face, the tiredness in it, the something else in it that she had been noticing for 2 days and not examining. You don't owe me that, he said. I know I don't, she said. I'm doing it anyway. He was quiet. Tomorrow, she said. Tonight, eat something and sleep somewhere. We've been on the road long enough. He almost smiled. It didn't fully arrive, but it came close. Margaret had gone back inside, and they were standing alone on the boardwalk with the piano 2 blocks over and the deputies somewhere on the south road and the ledger in a safe, and all of it irreversible now. The thing that had been set in motion in a ranch yard at sunrise with a branding iron and 60 silent men was moving, and it was not going to stop. Tamsin finished the cornbread, folded the paper, set it on the rail. Her wrist still ached. She was going to be tired for a week. But Crowder had ridden through the night to Casper because he was scared, and Greaves's deputies were riding toward Blackthorn Basin, and the ledger with 19 years of evidence written in Crowder's own hand was locked in a Territorial Marshal's safe. She had walked out of that yard. This was what walking out looked like 36 hours later. The street was quiet. Somewhere beyond it, the road south stretched back toward Blackthorn Basin, toward the ranch yard where the branding iron had gone cold, toward a cattle empire that had been built on the assumption that certain people were too small and too powerless and too isolated to ever put all the pieces together. She had put all the pieces together. The rest was already in motion. Rourke walked into the marshal's office at 8 o'clock the following morning, the way a man walks into something he has decided to walk into, without hesitation, because hesitation wouldn't change what was on the other side of the door, and he had never been a person who wasted energy on the version of events he couldn't control. Tamsin was already inside. She had been there since 7:30, which was when Greaves arrived, and she had spent the intervening time going over the points she intended to make about Rourke's documents, their provenance, their preservation, the 7 years of careful custody that had kept them intact and available for exactly this moment. She had not prepared a speech. She had prepared facts, organized in the order most likely to be useful to a man who thought in evidence rather than in appeals. Greaves looked up when Rourke came in. He gestured at the chair across from his desk. Rourke sat. He looked at Greaves. He did not look around the room checking exits, which Tamsin noted because she had half expected him to. The outstanding warrants, Greaves said, opening a folder. Converse County, trespassing, theft of government property, 2 counts. Carbon County, trespassing, same property charge, 1 count. Both stemming from the same incident, the Rollins Records Office, 7 years ago. Yes, Rourke said. You've never disputed the facts of what happened. No point disputing facts. Greaves looked at him over the folder. Most men in your position would have tried to cut a deal years ago. Turned the documents over in exchange for reduced charges. Why didn't you? Rourke was quiet for a moment. Because turning them over to the wrong office would have made them disappear, he said. Crowder had reach. I'd seen what happened when people tried to report him through official channels. The documents were only useful if they went somewhere Crowder couldn't get ahead of. He paused. I didn't find that place until she walked out of his ranch yard with the ledger. Greaves looked at Tamsin, then back at Rourke. The documents you provided, Greaves said, have been authenticated by my office against the original records still held in the Rawlins Territorial Archive. They match. You copied them accurately and completely, and you did not alter them in any way. He set the folder down. The theft charge rests on the act of unauthorized copying of government records. The records themselves were returned. You took copies, not originals. Yes. That distinction matters legally. Greaves laced his fingers on the desk. It doesn't eliminate the charge, but it matters. He looked at Tamsin. Miss Vale, you indicated you had something to say regarding the mitigating circumstances. Tamsin said what she had come to say. She said it plainly and in order. Rourke's sister, the 3 letters, the 3-week ride, the officials who told him there was nothing to investigate, the specific phrasing one of them had used about grief affecting his judgment. She described what he had found and what he had done with it and what he had not done, which was sell it or use it for leverage or let it become anything other than what it was. Evidence of a crime preserved against the day it could be used. She said, he didn't profit from those documents. He didn't use them to bargain with. He kept them for 7 years because he believed they were true, and he was waiting for a context where the truth would matter. She looked at Greaves steadily. That context is now. Greaves was quiet for a moment. I'm going to forward a recommendation to the circuit prosecutor, he said finally, that the charges be reduced to a single count of unauthorized access with time served calculated against the 7 years of effective exile that resulted from the active warrants. He paused. I cannot guarantee how the prosecutor will respond. I can tell you that my recommendation will be accompanied by a full account of the evidentiary contribution and the circumstances. He looked at Rourke. You'll need to stay in Casper until the prosecutor responds. That could be 2 weeks. Could be a month. I'll stay, Rourke said. And if the recommendation isn't followed, if they push for the full charge, then I'll deal with that when it happens, Rourke said. I'm not running. Greaves nodded once. He picked up his pen. Then we proceed. The arrest of Silas Crowder happened not at Blackthorn Ranch, as Greaves's deputies had planned, but on the road south of Casper, which was where Crowder apparently decided to be at 6 o'clock that same morning. He had not run exactly. Running would have required him to abandon the story he was still trying to tell, the story of a wronged employer pursuing a thieving employee through proper legal channels. He had left the Casper Hotel before dawn with 2 men in a wagon loaded with what his ranch foreman later described as cash, selected account books, and a box of documents that were never recovered. The deputies intercepted the wagon 4 miles south of town. Crowder had a lawyer present, which meant he had sent for one the previous afternoon, which meant he had known before he rode to Judge Harrison's chambers that the odds were not good. He was arrested without the violent confrontation everyone had half expected. He sat in the wagon seat and looked at the territorial warrants, and then looked at the 2 men he'd brought with him, and neither of them moved to help him, because they were ranch hands, not soldiers, and the territorial marshals had rifles and the authority to use them. Greaves told Tamsin about it that afternoon in his office, in the brief, factual way of a man describing an event that had gone more or less according to what he'd hoped. He asked to speak to Judge Harrison, Greaves said. Did Harrison see him? He did. Crowder presented an argument that the warrant was based on stolen evidence and should be voided. Greaves looked at the papers on his desk. Harrison told him the evidentiary question was a matter for trial and did not constitute grounds to void a territorial arrest warrant. Tamsin was quiet for a moment. And Beaumont, she asked, served this morning at his office in the county seat. He's arguing coercion, that Crowder pressured him into issuing the warrant for your arrest. Greaves's expression suggested how he felt about that argument. He may not be entirely wrong, but coercion doesn't excuse the years of documented cooperation before this particular incident. No, Tamsin agreed. It doesn't. She walked back to the boarding house where she and Margaret had taken rooms. Not Odessa's, but a similar establishment run by a woman named Carr, who did not ask questions either,
which was becoming a theme in Tamsin's assessment of the boarding house industry. And she sat on the edge of the bed in the afternoon light and felt, for the first time in 36 hours, the full weight of her own exhaustion. Not just the physical kind, the other kind. The kind that comes after you've been running on the fuel of necessity and there is finally, briefly, no immediate emergency requiring that fuel. She had been afraid in that yard. She had not admitted that to herself clearly until now, sitting in a quiet room with a locked door and nowhere she needed to be for the next few hours. The fear had been there the whole time. Not the shrieking kind, but the cold, specific kind that lives in your chest when you understand that the thing happening to you is real and the people watching it could stop it and are choosing not to. She had been afraid, and she had said, "Please help me," and 60 men had done nothing. And then one man had ridden through the gate at a walk. She thought about what it meant that the thing that saved her was not, in the end, one man's intervention. Rourke had given her room to stand. That was true, and she would not diminish it. But what had actually dismantled Crowder's machine was the ledger, the numbers, the names, the 19 years of careful fraud recorded in his own handwriting. The evidence she had read and mapped and carried across 40 miles and laid out on a territorial marshal's table in order. The body Crowder had spent 7 years using as a reason she didn't deserve to be taken seriously had walked every one of those 40 miles. The mind he'd never bothered to account for had organized 41 accounts into a prosecutable case in 36 hours. She was thinking about that when a knock came at the door. "It's Margaret," said Margaret's voice. Tamsin got up and opened it. Margaret came in and sat in the chair by the window. She looked tired in the same deep way Tamsin felt. Not beaten, but emptied out, like a vessel that had been holding something under pressure and had finally been allowed to set it down. "I got a letter off to my son," Margaret said. "Told him I was well and I'd explain everything in person when I could." She looked at her hands. "I don't know how to explain it in a letter." "You don't have to explain it in a letter," Tamsin said. "You just have to tell him you're all right. He's going to ask why I never told him." "What are you going to say?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That I thought I was protecting him," she said, which was true, and that I was also afraid, and that the fear got so familiar I stopped noticing it was there. She looked at the window. "That's not an easy thing to tell your child, that his mother was afraid for 6 years and didn't know how to stop being afraid." "It's an honest thing," Tamsin said. "Honest and easy aren't the same." "No," Tamsin said, "they're really not." They sat together in the quiet of the room, the two of them, in the particular companionship of people who have been through the same weather and don't need to describe it to each other. The territorial investigation into Silas Crowder's operations at Blackthorn Ranch took 11 months. It was not a clean 11 months. It was not a process that moved in a straight line from accusation to justice, because nothing involving a man with Crowder's money and connections ever moved in a straight line. He hired 3 lawyers from Denver and 1 from Cheyenne. He filed challenges to the admissibility of the ledger, to the chain of custody of Rourke's copies, to the legal standing of Lenora Pike's written testimony. He filed a civil suit against Tamsin for theft of private property, which was eventually dismissed but which required her to appear at a county court hearing and sit across a room from Crowder's lawyers for 4 hours while they described her as a disgruntled employee engaged in a coordinated campaign of harassment against a respected territorial businessman. She sat through all 4 hours without losing her composure, which cost her more than she showed. She had help. Greaves assigned a territorial advocate to her case, a dry, meticulous man named Aldous Fenn, who communicated primarily through written notes, but who was, as Greaves put it, very good at making civil suits for theft disappear when the alleged thief happens to have the stolen property's owner's handwritten fraud documented across 41 accounts. The suit was dismissed in the 4th month. In the 6th month, the circuit court ruled the ledger admissible. In the 7th, Lenora Pike came down from her homestead, voluntarily and at her own pace, having watched the first 6 months of proceedings from 14 miles north with the specific attention of someone who needed to see the direction before she committed her weight, and gave live testimony before the circuit court. She was in the witness chair for 2 days. She was precise, consistent, and utterly impossible to rattle, which Crowder's Denver lawyer tried 4 different approaches to accomplish and failed at all 4. In the 9th month,
3 of the surviving victims from the ledger's accounts gave testimony. One of them was Piotr Vasek, who had to travel from Nebraska to do it, and did so on a train ticket Tamsin helped pay for out of the wages she was finally collecting. She had found work in Casper during the investigation, bookkeeping for 2 local merchants who paid her what the work was actually worth, which was more than she'd seen in 7 years combined. In the 10th month, in Silas Crowder's criminal trial deliberated for 3 days. Tamsin sat in the courtroom for all 3 days. She did not pace. She did not talk much. She ate the food people brought her, and she slept in the boarding house when she could, and she came back every morning and sat in the same seat in the gallery and waited. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the jury came back. Crowder was convicted on 14 counts: fraud, extortion, unlawful confinement, bribery of a public official, falsification of territorial records, and the charge Tamsin had not expected to see survive the legal challenges, but which Fenn had fought for specifically: conspiracy to commit wage theft across multiple victims over an extended period, which carried the stiffest sentencing guidelines of anything on the list. She heard the verdict read. She did not cry. She did not cheer. She sat in her seat in the gallery and listened to each count come in, and she felt something release in her chest. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, count by count, like a rope being cut one strand at a time. Crowder stood at the defense table in his expensive coat and heard it without visible expression, which she supposed was the last dignity available to him. His 3 Denver lawyers were already calculating appeals. She knew that. This was not over in the sense of being finished. It would continue through appeals and sentencing hearings and the ongoing civil proceedings to determine compensation for victims, and she would have to be present for portions of all of it. But the verdict was in, and she sat in that courtroom and thought, 19 years. 19 years of a machine built on the assumption that isolated, desperate people would stay isolated and desperate, that they would never find each other, that the information would stay fragmented, that nobody would put it all in one place. She thought about her father, who had borrowed $438 and died before he could repay it, and whose debt had been turned into a cage 7 years long. She thought about Clara Maddox, who had written 3 letters and then gone silent. She thought about the 7 names in the ledger listed as account closed, debt forgiven, whose debts had been forgiven only because there was nobody left alive to collect from. She thought about all the things that don't get undone by a verdict, the years people don't get back, the fear that has become so familiar you stop noticing it, the specific loneliness of being right about something for a long time with nobody who will believe you. None of that was in the jury's decision, but the decision was real, and it was a place to start building something that wasn't what had been there before. What? Sheriff Beaumont was convicted of bribery and misconduct in the 9th month, separately from Crowder's trial. He received a lesser sentence in exchange for testimony about the extent of Crowder's reach into county administration, which testimony helped establish the conspiracy charges. He lost his badge and spent 14 months in territorial custody before being released. Tamsin did not attend his trial. She had enough to attend without adding that. Blackthorn Ranch was placed in territorial receivership during the investigation and afterward broken apart. The cattle operation was restructured into 3 smaller ranches, one of which was organized as a cooperative owned by the workers who had remained through the investigation, including Garrett, the foreman who had taken one step to the side in the ranch yard on that first morning, who turned out to be a more complicated man than that single gesture suggested. He had cooperated with the investigators fully, testified about the wage structure and the fabricated charges, and used what institutional knowledge he had of the ranch's operations to help the cooperative transition work. Tamsin did not forgive him for the years before that step, but she understood that people often do the right thing one step at a time, and only after the cost of the wrong thing becomes visible enough to see. The recovered assets from Crowder's fraudulent operations, the money traced through Lenora's account records to the Casper, Denver, and Santa Fe banks, were partially distributed to surviving victims after territorial administration fees were deducted, which was not the full justice anyone had wanted, but was more than any of them had expected to see. Tamsin received wages for 7 years at the rate promised in her original contract, minus legitimate housing and supply costs, plus a supplemental payment from the Fraud Recovery Fund. It was not a fortune. It was enough. She opened the Vail Frontier Contract Office in Mercy Ridge 6 months after the verdict, in a small room she rented above the general store. Odessa helped her hang the sign. It was a plain sign. No flourishes, just the name and below it, labor contracts reviewed, no charge for the first reading. The first person who came through the door was a woman of about 40 with a labor contract for a mining operation in Carbon County that she didn't understand. Tamsin read it in 20 minutes and found two clauses that would have resulted in the woman working indefinitely at reduced wages under circumstances the woman hadn't agreed to when she signed. "Here," Tamsin said, pointing at the clause, "and here. Before you go back to them, you cross these out and you initial the crossed out sections and you have them initial them too. If they refuse, you walk away." The woman looked at the clauses. "He told me it was standard." "It's not standard," Tamsin said. "Standard means both parties understand what they're agreeing to. This means one party understands and the other doesn't." The woman looked at her. "How do I know you're right?" "You don't," Tamsin said. "You take this to a lawyer if you want a second opinion. I'll write down what I found and you can show it to whoever you like." She pulled a paper toward her. "But I've been reading contracts for a year and a half, and before that I spent 7 years inside one that was built to trap me, and I know what the trap looks like." The woman took the paper she wrote. She came back 3 days later to say she had gone back to the mining operation, crossed out the clauses, and they had initialed without argument. "Why did they agree so easily?" the woman asked. "Because most of the time," Tamsin said, "the clause is there on the chance that the person signing doesn't notice it. When you notice it, the negotiation changes." Word moved the way word moves in frontier territories, not through newspapers or formal announcements, but through the specific channel of women talking to women, of workers in boarding houses comparing notes, of people who had been handed a contract they couldn't read, passing the information forward to people who were about to be handed the same. By the end of the first year, Tamsin was seeing 6 or 7 people a week. By the end of the second, she had hired a young woman named Petra Sells, who had been a school teacher before her school lost its funding, and who turned out to have the same instinct for finding the hidden thing in a document that Tamsin had spent 7 years developing the hard way. Rourke's charges were resolved in the 3rd month after the verdict. The circuit prosecutor accepted Greaves's recommendation, reduced to a single count of unauthorized access, with the 7 years of effective exile counted as time served, and a fine of $40 that Rourke paid without discussion. He walked out of the Casper courthouse in the November cold with no outstanding warrants for the first time in 7 years, and Tamsin was waiting on the step. He looked at her. $40, she said. "Don't start," he said. "I'm just saying, 7 years, and it cost you $40 and a fine." "In 7 years," he said. "In 7 years," she agreed. He came down the steps. They walked down the main street of Casper together. Not dramatically, not performing anything for anyone. Just two people walking in the same direction in the November cold, which was what they had been doing, in various ways, since a ranch yard at sunrise 11 months ago. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "There's land north of Mercy Ridge," he said. "I've been looking at it. Good horse country, water from the creek, enough pasture, timber for building." He paused. "I know horses." "You know horses," she confirmed. "I know some other things." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the street ahead, the particular look of a man who has said something that could be taken multiple ways and is waiting to see which way it gets taken. "I know some other things too," she said. He almost smiled, more than almost this time. It arrived. They walked on. They married the following spring, on a Tuesday, because Tuesday was when they had time and neither of them saw a reason to wait for a more ceremonially appropriate day. Odessa attended. Margaret Holloway came down from wherever she was living, which had ceased to be a secret since the trial. Petra Sells attended. Greaves sent a letter he had written in his characteristic dry way that managed, in 4 paragraphs, to say something genuinely warm. It was not a large wedding. They had not wanted a large wedding. And more to the point, Tamsin had been to enough events in her life where her size was the first thing people registered and the last thing they forgot. And she did not want her wedding to be one of them. She wanted a small room and people who knew her. That was what she got. Lenora Pike did not come. She sent a brief note, 3 sentences, her handwriting the same careful, educated script Tamsin had seen on the pages from the wooden box, that said she was well, that she was glad, and that her daughter in Colorado had a baby girl, and that Lenora had been to visit twice. She signed it with her name and nothing else. Tamsin kept the note. 2 years after the verdict, she and Rourke went back to Blackthorn Basin. She had not planned to. It was not a sentimental journey. She had not looked back at Crowder's ranch with anything resembling nostalgia, and she had no desire to see the place as it had been. But the cooperative had sent her a letter asking if she would come and review their new worker contracts, which they were renegotiating as the operation found its footing, and she said yes because it was work, and because the people asking were people who deserved to have someone look at the numbers on their behalf. She rode out with Rourke on an October morning, the basin spread in fall color on both sides of the road. And when the main yard came into view, she felt something. Not the old fear, not exactly, but the memory of it, the shape of where it had lived in her chest, like pressing on a healed place and feeling the echo of what it had been. The yard was different, not architecturally. The buildings were the same, the fence lines, the general layout of a working cattle operation. But the atmosphere was different in the specific way that atmosphere is different when the person who set its tone is gone. People moved differently, spoke differently. There was the normal noise of work, not the tense, watchful quiet of a place where someone is always listening. She met with the cooperative's elected managers, 3 of them, including a woman named Bess who had been one of the kitchen hands during the years Tamsin worked there. Bess shook Tamsin's hand and held it an extra second. "I should have stepped forward," Bess said. "In the yard, that morning." "You didn't," Tamsin said. "None of you did. I know why. Knowing why doesn't make it right." "No," Tamsin agreed. "It doesn't." They sat with the contracts for 3 hours. Tamsin found 2 provisions that needed clarifying and 1 that needed removing entirely. And she walked the managers through each one the same way she walked everyone through everything. Not performing expertise, not making herself larger than the information, just reading carefully and pointing at what she saw. Afterward, she walked through the yard alone while Rourke talked horses with one of the hands. She walked to the place where the fire had been. There was nothing there now. The iron stand was gone. The ground had been turned and walked over 100,000 times in 2 years, and the exact spot where she had stood with bound wrists in the cold was indistinguishable from the rest of the packed earth around it. She stood there anyway. She thought about the woman who had stood in this spot and said, "Please help me," and heard nothing back. She thought about what it takes to keep moving when nobody answers. She had not been brave in the heroic sense that morning. She had been frightened and alone and running out of options, and what she had done was not the product of courage so much as the product of having done the arithmetic and understood, with cold clarity, that staying was worse than anything she might face by leaving. That was not bravery. That was accounting. And accounting was something she had always been good at, even when Crowder was telling her she was too stupid and too large and too much of a burden to understand the numbers. She had understood the numbers. That was all it had been, in the end. She had understood the numbers, and she had gotten them to someone with the authority to use them, and she had not stopped moving until that happened. The rest, the verdict, the recovery, the cooperative standing in the yard behind her, the office in Mercy Ridge with its plain sign and its open door. The rest was what happens when numbers meet daylight. She had been thinking lately about what she would tell someone who came to her with a contract they couldn't understand and a situation they couldn't see the way out of. Not the contract advice. That was technical, and technical she could teach. The other thing. The thing about what to do when you've been told for so long that your understanding is wrong that you've started to wonder if maybe it is. She thought she would tell them, trust the arithmetic. Not the arithmetic someone else has done for you, with their hand on the pencil and their stake in the outcome. Your own arithmetic. The numbers you've checked 3 times because you can't believe the answer, and then checked again, and each time they come up the same. When your arithmetic says something is wrong, it is wrong. Even when 60 people are standing around telling you otherwise. Even when the person holding the iron has a smile that suggests you've misunderstood the whole situation. Even then, trust the arithmetic. And then, if you can, find the room. Find the person who will stand between you and the iron long enough for you to think. Not to do it for you, just to give you room. After that, you do the rest yourself. Rourke came up beside her. He didn't say anything about what she was looking at or what she was thinking. He just stood there in the way he had always stood beside her, without making himself large, without filling the space she needed. She looked at him. I was the same as he'd been in the yard that first morning, weathered, steady, a man who had ridden through something and come out the other side of it with most of his useful parts intact. He had not become easier or softer or more comfortable in the 2 years since. He still came in through the back when there was a back to come through. He still said less than most people and meant more of it. He still had mornings where the weight of his sister was visible on him, where the fact of what Crowder had done and could not be made undone sat with him quietly and heavily. And she would bring him coffee and not say anything, because some things don't resolve, they just get carried differently over time. She was not herself the kind of woman who had resolved everything and arrived at peace. She still woke sometimes in the night reaching for the packet that no longer needed protecting. She still felt, occasionally, the specific anger of a person who had been right for years inside a system designed to make her doubt it. She did not expect those things to go away entirely. She had stopped expecting her own healing to look neat. But she was here. The arithmetic had been right. The numbers had reached daylight. She reached over and took Rourke's hand. He looked at their hands, then at her. "Ready to go?" he said. "Almost," she said. She looked at the yard one more time, at the cooperative's horses in the paddock, at the kitchen door where Bess was moving around inside, at the blue October sky over the basin, the same sky that had been there that morning 2 years ago, indifferent and clear. Then she turned her back on it. "Now I'm ready," she said. They walked out through the gate together, the woman who had knelt in this yard with bound wrists and the man who had ridden through the crowd at a walk. And the gate closed behind them, and neither of them looked back. The road to Mercy Ridge was 8 miles. She knew every one of them. They were 3 miles from Mercy Ridge when Rourke said, "Petra sent a letter last week." Tamsin looked at him. "You didn't tell me." "I'm telling you now." He kept his eyes on the road. She said a woman came into the office, 40-some years old, traveling alone from Utah Territory, had a contract for domestic work on a ranch outside of Rawlins. Petra read it and found a clause that would have signed over the woman's personal property, everything she owned, as collateral against wages not yet earned. Tamsin was quiet for a moment. "Petra caught it," she said. "Petra caught it." He paused. "Woman sat in your office and cried for 20 minutes, apparently. Then she dried her face and asked Petra to help her write a counteroffer." Tamsin looked at the road ahead, at the familiar line of cottonwoods that meant the creek was close, which meant town was close, which meant her office was close with its plain sign and its open door, and Petra Sells at the desk doing work that needed doing. "That's what it's for," she said. "I know," Rourke said. "I just thought you should hear it." Mercy Ridge had changed in 2 years, not dramatically, not in the way of a boomtown chasing silver or cattle money, but in the quiet accumulation of small things that add up to a place becoming more itself. A second merchant had opened on the main street. The schoolhouse on the north end had a new roof, funded partly by a territorial education grant and partly by a collection taken up at a town meeting that Odessa had organized with her characteristic efficiency and zero tolerance for people who pledged money and then failed to produce it. The Vale Frontier Contract Office occupied the same room above the general store where it had started, except that room had expanded into the adjoining space 6 months ago when the volume of people coming through the door made the original room inadequate. It now had 2 desks, Tamsin's and Petra's, a shelf of territorial law references that Tamsin had been collecting since the trial, and a bench along the wall where people could sit while they waited, which they increasingly did. When Tamsin came up the stairs that afternoon, Petra was at her desk with a contract spread out in front of her, and the expression of someone who has found something and is deciding how angry to be about it. "Good trip?" Petra said without looking up. "Productive," Tamsin said. She set her coat on the hook and came to look over Petra's shoulder. "What is it?" "Mining contract from the Elkhorn operation in Carbon County. 3rd one I've seen from them this month." Petra pointed at a clause midway down the 2nd page. "They've changed the language on the injury provision. Last month's version said the operation bore responsibility for documented workplace injuries. This version says the worker bears responsibility for any injury sustained through, and I'm reading directly, failure to exercise adequate personal caution as defined by operation management." Tamsin read the clause. "Read it again." "Which means management defines caution however they like after the injury happens," she said. "Which means any injury can retroactively become the worker's fault." Petra looked up at her. "The man who brought this in has 3 children. He's been mining for 12 years without a serious injury. He said the foreman told him the new language was just standard legal protection and not to worry about it. Where is he? Waiting downstairs. I told him not to sign anything until you'd seen it. Tamsin straightened up. She thought about the woman from Utah Territory, sitting in this office crying before she dried her face and asked for help writing a counteroffer. She thought about the Elkhorn mining operation in Carbon County, which was apparently working its way through a new contract template designed by someone who understood exactly what the language meant and was counting on the workers not to. Bring him up, she said, and pull the last 2 Elkhorn contracts from the file. I want to show him how the language changed month to month. Petra was already standing. Guam. The man's name was Del Hooper. He was broad-handed and sun-worn, with the careful movements of someone who spent his working life in spaces where careless movement had consequences. He sat across from Tamsin's desk and looked at the 3 contracts she laid out side by side, the earlier versions and the new one, and followed her finger as she walked him through the progression. Same operation, she said, same position. Watch the injury clause across all 3. He read slowly. She waited. She had learned in 2 years of this work that waiting was most of the job. People needed time to see the thing themselves, not just to be told it was there. It changed, he said. It changed. The foreman said it was standard. The foreman may genuinely believe that, Tamsin said, or the foreman may know exactly what it means and be hoping you don't. I can't tell you which. What I can tell you is that this language does not protect you, and the earlier language did, and you have the right to ask them to restore it before you sign. Del looked at the contracts. He rubbed the side of his jaw with his thumb, a gesture so like Rourke's that it caught her for a moment. And if they say no? He asked. Then you have information you didn't have before, she said. What you do with it is your decision. I can tell you what the contract says. I can't tell you what your situation requires. He nodded slowly. He looked at the 3 contracts again, at the steady progression of language shifting in one direction while the position and the wages stayed the same. How long has this been going on? He asked. Not about Elkhorn specifically, about the larger thing. Tamsin looked at him. Long enough, she said. But people are reading now who weren't reading before. That changes things. He took the contracts, all 3, because Tamsin gave him the copies to keep. And he went back down the stairs with the particular posture of a man who had come in uncertain and was leaving with something solid in his hands. Even if that something was just information. Information was enough. Information was where it started. She watched him go and then sat at her desk in the late afternoon quiet. Through the window she could see the main street of Mercy Ridge, Odessa crossing toward the dry goods store, a wagon coming in from the east road, 2 men talking outside the livery. The ordinary motion of a small frontier town going about its business on an October afternoon. She thought about the woman from Utah Territory. She thought about Del Hooper and his 3 children. She thought about Petra, who had been a school teacher and was now doing the most important teaching of her life, 1 contract at a time, at a desk 6 feet from Tamsin's. She thought about the 41 names in Crowder's ledger, the ones who had testified, the ones who had taken their recovered wages and gone somewhere else to start over, the ones listed as account closed whose names she still said in her own mind sometimes, quietly, so they were not entirely forgotten. She thought about her father, who had borrowed $438 in a hard season and had never imagined what that debt would become, or what his daughter would do with the arithmetic of it. She hoped, in the way a person hopes about someone they can no longer speak to, that he would have recognized her, that he would have looked at the sign above the general store and at the woman who put it there and seen something he had planted, even without knowing it. She thought he would have. That evening, Rourke had a fire going when she got home. Not the horse ranch yet. That was still being built, the frame up and the roof half done, progressing at the pace of a man who did not cut corners on foundations. They were still in town, in the small house on the north edge of Mercy Ridge that they had rented since the spring, and the fire was going and there was food on the stove, and the dog they had acquired somewhat accidentally 3 months ago was asleep in front of the hearth, taking up significantly more than his share of the floor. Tamsin sat down and pulled off her boots, and the dog opened one eye and then closed it again, unimpressed. Rourke brought 2 cups and sat in the other chair, and they were quiet together in the way they had learned to be quiet together, which was comfortably, without the need to fill it. Del Hooper is going back to Elkhorn tomorrow to renegotiate the injury clause, she said. Good.
Petra found 2 more contracts from the same operation last month with modified language. I'm going to write to the Territorial Labor Office about it. Good, he said again. She looked at the fire. It doesn't stop, she said, not complaining, just noting the fact of it. No, he said. Someone writes new language, someone else reads it and finds it, and then someone writes newer language and someone else reads that. She wrapped both hands around her cup. I used to think there was an end to it, that you fix the thing and the thing stays fixed. Rourke looked at her. Does that bother you? She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything, without rushing to the answer she was supposed to have. No, she said. Not anymore. She looked at the fire. The work is the work. It doesn't finish. But every person who comes through that door and leaves understanding what they signed, that's real. Real. That happened. Nobody can put it back. He was quiet for a moment. Clara would have come through your door, he said. He said it simply, without the weight of grief that it might have carried a year ago. Not without sadness, but with the specific piece of someone who has set something down, not because it stopped mattering, but because they found somewhere to put it. Tamsin looked at him. I know, she said. The fire burned. The dog shifted in his sleep. Outside, Mercy Ridge went quiet in the way of small towns after dark. Not silent, but settled, the sounds of a place that had found its own pace and kept to it. Tamsin Vale sat in the firelight, with her cup in her hands and her husband in the chair across from her, and she thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known 7 years ago standing in a ranch yard with bound wrists. That the people who build systems designed to keep other people small are counting on one thing above everything else. Not the contracts, not the numbers, not even the silence of 60 bystanders. They are counting on you to believe them, to accept their accounting of your worth, your capability, your right to take up space and ask questions and refuse to sign what you don't understand. The whole machine runs on that acceptance. The moment you stop accepting it, the moment you look at the number and say, this is wrong, and I know it is wrong, and I'm going to keep saying so until someone with authority to act on it actually listens, the machine loses the one thing it cannot replace: your belief in it. She had stopped believing it on a cold morning 7 years ago, standing in a bunkhouse going over arithmetic she had checked 3 times. She had carried that stopped belief through 7 years of being told she was wrong, and then she had walked out of a gate with a ledger under her arm, and the rest had followed. It was not a clean story. It did not have edges that met perfectly. There were names in a ledger that no verdict could make whole, and a man in Colorado who had grown up without understanding why his mother disappeared for 9 years, and a woman on a homestead north of Mercy Ridge who would probably never fully come down from the altitude she had chosen for her isolation. But there was also a cooperative in Blackthorn Basin where workers voted on their own contracts. There was a schoolhouse with a new roof. There was Petra at her desk finding the hidden clause before it cost Del Hooper everything. And there was the door at the top of the stairs above the general store, which opened every morning and stayed open, and which anyone could walk through. That was real. That would remain. Tamsin finished her coffee and set the cup down and looked at the fire until it burned low, and then she got up and put another log on because the night was cold and there was no reason to let good heat die when you had wood enough to keep it going.